it's interesting. I talked about the customer, and the thing coming to Freshwave. Oh, excuse me, too much.
Black Heart.
Too much Black Heart too quickly.
Obviously, a bit of fizz in it.
Yeah. The thing, and look, operators are big organisations by their nature. You are, as an engineer, and I say that as somebody who was in new product development and delivery for 20 years, a long way from the customer. And I joined Freshwave, and on day one, I've got a customer in my ear.
Right.
And I like that. I genuinely like that, right? We sell to enterprises, and the customers know us, and we do a good job. We think we do a good job. And if we don't do a good job, we do a lessons learned. We're very keen on that. But that keeps you honest.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, which is a bit of a technology question, those customers, when I think about the head of IT, right, I'm the head of IT of Informa, I'm betting is a tech-savvy individual but resource light, because the CFO doesn't like to give them any money. As a rule of thumb. My CFO is no different.
Right.
So they're tech-savvy, they understand that. They also understand the limitation on Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi with a building such as this, depending on your occupancy, voice over Wi-Fi isn't going to answer the question.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. First one for a couple of weeks, and the one we did 2 weeks ago was remote because Pierre was gallivanting around like a little globetrotter that you are. So welcome back, and I'm pleased to announce that this first one back in the studio for 3 weeks, we got a special guest who is Tom Bennett from Freshwave.
Pleased to meet you.
So we know each other for a little while because I met you when you were at EE, but
Yes.
but this is the first time we've chatted since you were in this, guys. So we'll get into all that.
Excellent.
And what else has been going on? I think, Tom, you've just been getting over a bug, haven't you?
Mm-hmm.
I have too. I've had a cold all week.
Likewise.
Which is, without going into too much detail, has involved lots of nose blowing. I know. This is making Pierre
You're telling me this now while I'm in this room?
Yeah. Well, we've done ones where you've been the ill one.
You love something that hasn't affected you yet after being on a long-haul flight.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. Where you didn't go off somewhere?
No, Pierre did.
Just Pierre, yeah. Okay.
British Columbia.
No, but you two are going to Big 5G soon, aren't
That's in a few weeks,
In a few
to
weeks,
Austin.
right.
Yeah.
Are you going to go to Joe Rogan's club?
Probably. I
could
think we'll walk
try.
past it at least.
It's unlikely.
Okay.
He's not popular with other members of Light Reading, I don't think.
Who isn't?
Joe Rogan.
Right. What, because of perceived
I seem to remember
political...
going past it last year and people going, "Oh, you didn't get up there, did you? He's awful, that guy."
No, it wasn't open. It wasn't open.
No, we walked
last year.
past it though, didn't we?
No, it wasn't open.
Yeah, but I remember going
Oh,
past it.
yeah. It was.
Didn't go
Well,
in.
maybe it was
Unless I imagined
That
it.
was the
club he was gigging.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, as with so many other things, and we might get to it in one of our segments later on. You know, there's no grey areas in US sensibilities. Someone's either God or Satan.
Yeah.
So there we go. So yeah, it's been an all right week, but it's a bit of a cold, like wintry day today.
A bit.
Is it supposed to be
Yeah.
spring?
It was. I mean, earlier on in the week it felt springy.
We're like more than a month into spring.
Yeah,
It's horrible.
but no, today was foul. You were complaining of cold hands when you cycled in here. So that's probably why we all got colds as well. That's what happens. The weather sort of lulls you into a full sense of security and then just hits you with another little mini winter, and then everyone gets the plague. What else? Oh yeah, I just wanted to say I've noticed that Tom's brought in. He obviously knows about the pod. He's brought in not just beers but Brewdog. But I didn't know Brewdog did a stout. You brought a stout called Black Heart.
Yep.
Can I try one of those actually?
Yeah.
Do you want to nick one of his? Yeah.
There you go.
Do you like stout? Don't open it and go, You got to drink it. Oh no.
He's going to spray it over all of his equipment and
Yes, end of podcast.
So that noise was Pierre opening the Black Heart.
If he doesn't say anything now, you know that he doesn't really like it, but
Yeah.
he's just feeling that he has to.
No, he's taken a good quaff.
Kind of flat, isn't it?
Yeah, a little.
But stout's not meant to be.
It's not.
It's flatter than Guinness, but it's not bad.
Is it flatter than Hazy Jane?
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh.
Weirdly, like, there's no gas in it except when you open it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ironically, that was all of it. You need to have your gob over it when you open it. And we were just chatting before we started. I sort of set up a false dichotomy because there's Brewdog, which has all these different ones. And Tom, actually, you've outdone yourself. You brought in, and we got to give a shout out to Amy in the background, Tom's colleague, who apparently did the beer shopping.
Yep. The multi-pack.
The multi-pack of Brewdog, which includes Hazy Jane and the regular one and Elvis juice. We like a bit of Elvis juice, don't we?
Elvis juice, yeah.
Sounds so wrong.
It does, doesn't it?
It's like his sweat.
At least. And then we were just comparing that to the other big sort of American style IPA one that we all tend to drink, and we definitely drink it in a pub over the road, which is Beavertown, which does neck oil and gamma ray and what was it? When Ed came in, he had one called, was it Lupuloid? It was about 6.5%.
Oh, I tell you what,
Sounds like a disease.
Yeah, it
British
does. That
Columbia-
definitely does, yeah.
in British Columbia, they have an enormous variety of like IPAs and
Oh, we're allowed to
West
know where you
Coast-
were now.
yeah, and they're all so strong, like
Right.
6.5,
Yeah.
7. I couldn't find a beer that
Do
was
they taste
5%.
okay? 'Cause
They
normally
taste
beers
good, but
that
they
are
taste like
strong.
in your face.
Yeah.
like, strong. Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, the generalisation about more northern latitudes is they tend to get pissed. They
No,
tend
it's
to put a
funny.
premium on.
They have one side has these kind of beers, and then the other half has like Coors Light.
Right.
Is that true? The closer you get to the equator, the less likely people are to get pissed.
Well, I'm just generalising.
That's not
No, that's not true. No.
No, I'm generalising about the Nordics. I mean, people generally associate them with getting off their tits quite a lot. The assumption being that, the
You've got to
weather.
get through the long winter nights somehow.
Well, there we
Yeah.
go.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering whether that, which is presumably a very crude and unfair generalisation, also applies to Canada. That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll leave it there. Perhaps I'll stop digging on that one. But anyway, yeah, we were just comparing Brewdog and Beavertown, saying which is better, and we don't think there is one necessarily better. Although Beavertown, you do pay a premium, certainly at Sainsbury's.
We're
you
lucky to
get-
have both.
Yeah, we are lucky to have both. If you get a 4-pack of neck oil versus a 4-pack of Hazy Jane, it'll be about a quid more normally. I'm not sure it's a quid better. It's pretty equivalent stuff.
I'm not
to
going to
me.
worry about a quid though when you spend £7 to get one in the pub.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
know. That's
They have locked up the London pub scene pretty well.
They have done
Beavertown.
really well.
yeah. They have. In
Well,
fact,
it's punk, isn't it? It's only usually in their own Brewdog
Exactly.
pubs, isn't it?
no, they've done an amazing job with distribution. Beavertown. In fact, that leads me on to a bit of research I did. I get, I like to get those Daddy Stars from Sainsbury's.
Yeah.
And we quite
It's still a good deal.
as often as not, we do like delivery orders now, just because we're lazy. But the problem with delivery orders is if you order something and they haven't got it, they do a replacement. Now, you can reject the replacement, but if I've ordered, if I need to stock up on beers, I'm not going to reject the replacement because whatever the replacement is, it's better than having no beer,
Yeah.
is my logic. But they replaced them with a beer called Madri this time, and I was aware of it, and I was aware that it's supposed to be this Spanish beer, but I've never seen it in Barcelona. Have you? There's not like
Only if it's
there's
the-
Estrella and
Not Spanish.
Estrella and Dos
San
Equis
Miguel.
and San Miguel and all that sort of thing.
Right. I married a Spaniard. It's not Spanish.
Yeah, well, and I always figured that. I also figured it because I hadn't even heard of it till a couple of years ago. And so I was sitting there, I was talking to my wife, giving her all this, this is bullshit, they've just invented this. And then I went off and did a bit of research. And yeah, it turns out Madri went from 0 to 60 in about 2020. It's made by Coors Molson.
Right.
It's made in the UK, as you were just suggesting, Tom. And it's, it's no more Spanish than I am.
Yeah, but so are the like.
In fact, less so, 'cause at least I can
Kronenberg
speak
is
a bit.
brewed in Scotland as well, like the old brewed.
Yeah, but the point is, it never was. It's not like.
Oh, he's never
It's not
was.
like Estrella.
It's not brewed under license.
Oh wow,
Yeah, it was never a Spanish beer. They just invented it.
it's marketing.
I know, it's shocking, isn't it?
Well, if they decide they want to be Spanish, Scott, then they can be Spanish. That's what it's all about these days.
Indeed.
That's cultural appropriation.
Who am I to misgender them? And I just thought, anyway, and I called it, and then I triumphantly, when I found this sort of Time Out article about it, so I went, ha, you see, to my wife, who was already bored of the subject.
Our audience is already bored of this.
Probably.
Good point. But I just think it's interesting how business and marketing sometimes works, where they can just sit down and go, let's invent a Spanish beer because we think there's an opportunity in the market. Maybe people are buying lots of Estrella or buying, or just some other, they call them like Mediterranean. Maybe people are buying lots of,
Biar Moretti.
Moretti or something
Super
like
dry's
that.
no different.
Were you what?
Super dry?
Isn't that Japanese?
Yeah, but it's not. It's British.
Oh, right, is it?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, shit, what about Asahi? Is that proper Japanese?
Yeah.
I sometimes have
that
that.
is proper Japanese.
Right. And but one of the reasons I ask is Asahi writes super dry on it. There's something about Japan and the phrase super dry because that's a big fashion label as well, isn't it?
That's what
What's
I
that
meant.
all about? Oh, you mean the fashion label? You weren't talking about a beer called Superdry. Oh, so that is not Japanese, the fashion label.
No.
God damn.
Being lied to.
I know, that's shocking. Yeah, and it's just funny how you can just invent these things. And of course, most people aren't going to bother to go off and Google it and go, is that authentic?
Yeah.
And I don't know if it matters. I mean, I had one of those Madries last night, and it was better than nothing, that's for sure.
But it wasn't as good as...
It's not as good as Star.
Yeah.
And not even as good as, like, my fallback from Star, if that's out, is normally Asahi. It's not as good as that either. But it's better than, like, a Carling or a Foster's or something like that. Which isn't saying much, of course. Anyway, so there we are. There's the tangent. I'll shut up on that one. Just to remind you that if you're watching us on the site, you can, or on YouTube or on Facebook, so I've still got a sniffle from my cold. You can also listen to it on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and loads of other podcasting platforms. You don't have anything to say, Producer Pierre, about who's listening to the show or anything like that?
There's next week will be the
Okay, all right.
City of the Month.
Cool. Well, we'll just crack on then. So, Tom, you are now working for a company called Freshwave, as we can tell from your T-shirt, which I threatened to say sounds a bit like a sort of Whole Food supermarket.
That's probably not an unfair challenge, let's be honest.
More like a toothpaste, you know? Like
Oh yeah, it can be a toothpaste as well. Freshwave.
Amy in the corner's making notes copiously. Yeah.
Amy's on the comms side. Next time they're having brainstorming about the branding.
Exactly.
You know, all you need is a little picture of a shopping trolley or a gleaming gob.
There's something very wholesome about the whole image with the colour and it's like an environmental thing.
And yet you're not
the strategy.
You're not concerned with any of these things. You're instead. Well, I'll let you introduce yourself. What's Freshwave all about, Tom?
So, Tom, pleased to meet you all. And Freshwave, we are a connectivity infrastructure as a service provider. What does that mean? We're a neutral host provider. So if you own a building, such as this one we're in, or you're an enterprise...
I hope you don't provide the connectivity for this building because it's shit.
No, we don't.
It's not that bad.
It's pretty bad.
The 4G isn't great.
Oh, yeah.
Introduce us to your IT guy. We can have a conversation.
Right, indeed.
Always looking for it.
It'll be a win-win, this podcast.
So, we provide connectivity, mobile signal for all the operators. The UK neutral host market and the UK neutral host technical specification is actually globally leading. You know, it's one of the reasons I joined.
Can I just ask, because you are doing something for a building in this area somewhere, and how does it work from a kind of user perspective? I mean, we're used to coming in and sort of logging onto the local Wi-Fi, but would you come in and you're, you know, as an employee of that company, you go straight onto the private network that's provided? Or I've never really thought about that. But
so it can be a private network, but in the main, it is just a neutral host provider. We provide the mobile service.
Right.
So most modern buildings, ESG requirement, you're all familiar with ESG, get into TLA acronyms.
Yeah, the environmental, social and governance.
So
the box ticking.
You say box ticking, most of the modern buildings now, the lovely Pilkington K glass is reflecting all the mobile signal. So you can't have mobile coverage. So to answer your question, depending on your strategy for your IT, you maybe you got bring your own device, maybe you got a corporate account with operator A or operator B, will provide coverage in the building because you're not getting it from the macro.
I see. So so that's one of the reasons I don't tend to get very good cellular coverage here, you reckon? Because this is largely a sort of shiny glass building. Yeah. Is that just as it reflects visible light, it also reflects other electromagnetic spectrum stuff.
Exactly.
Oh, wow.
And you would have a situation where all the operators could be using your infrastructure to provide a service in that building, basically.
It's a little bit existential, actually. As a neutral host, we work utterly in collaboration with the mobile operators. Yeah. To be really clear, we are providing their radio signal. That's what we do. That's what my team does.
You're just
we
doing
talk their language.
They don't have it.
We talk with their engineers. JOTS, I don't know if you know, I'm going to get into the technical bit now, the Joint Operator Technical Spec. To be fair to the UK operators, again, it is world leading. They've agreed a technical spec. I don't know if you know the history. It was started with the 2012 Olympics. So London 2012 Olympics, they divide up all the stadiums, all the different venues. Right. They're going to find a way of providing coverage for each other. That was actually the challenge to go back to 2012. So they created JOTS.
When you say they divided up, you mean different operators were in charge of providing connectivity to different venues?
Correct, exactly. So, but they've got to meet the spec for all the operators without competition lawyers being involved in every step of the process. So they created JOTS, and that JOTS specification now covers everything from DAS right down to small cell and femtos. So, depending on the scale and size of the building, we, neutral hosts, us and our competition, can now provide coverage for all the operators.
Wouldn't it make sense to do something like that because you've got this thing called the Shared Rural Initiative, haven't you, in the UK, where there's always this... Yeah. There's always this sort of to and fro between the operators about who's doing most of the work and whose equipment's being used. Wouldn't it be a better thing for that to be? Not necessarily for you guys, but I'm just sort of theoretically as
a neutral
host provider. Wouldn't that be the way around that to a certain extent?
I'll declare a personal piece. So I joined Freshwave 18 months ago. I was the technology director that led the negotiations for SRN, Shared Rural Network, for BT.
Right.
So to give you a little insight...
We knew you used to be there.
Yeah, so to give you a little insight, we did have a load of good technology conversations, as you'd expect, with the other operators, and oddly enough, a lot of competition lawyers in the room at that point, because we were competitors and go back to then.
So any time you're collaborating, there are
have to have a competition.
Competitive implications,
right. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons the mobile industry is necessarily painful to deal with sometimes if you're outside the mobile industry, because they're competitors. It's not their fault. That's the nature
and they're more
constrained.
I would say it's a more regulated, more constrained industry than most.
I mean, there is a lot of regulation for obvious stuff, everything from 999 to coverage obligations.
Yeah, but just because the fact that the barriers to entry to be an MNO, for example, or any kind of network owner are so high that it's necessarily a sort of...
Very CapEx intensive.
Yeah, exactly. It's necessarily quite restrictive. So I mean, I'm actually in favour, while I would prefer as much sort of as little state or regulatory involvement as possible, I'm actually in favour as telecoms journalist in regulation, because otherwise you'd probably get exactly the kind of cartel behaviour that you have to be careful to tiptoe around in the situations that you were just describing. Anyway,
so back to your SRN point. Yeah, we did look at other technologies. I don't know if you guys are familiar with multi-operator call network. You have one radio network, but then all the operators connect their calls to it.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? There's no single spectrum holding where you divide the spectrum equally amongst all the 4 operators that would have worked.
Right.
There are different commercial proposals. There's not necessarily a reason that the operators have to build these. Although with state fundings, back to your point, there are state funding rules where actually it has to be the operator putting their match funding in.
Right.
Ergo, it has to be their asset. So there were a few bits and pieces around everything from the accountancy to the technology to the regulation that went, SRM was the right answer. I personally led the negotiation with BT, as I say.
That multi-operator core thing only really works if the spectrum's equally divided, is that?
Because SRN had to be equal amongst the 4 operators.
I see, okay.
In that specific scenario.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Mocken, as it's called,
Correct,
isn't it? Whatever.
Mocken, Moran, yeah.
And there's loads of broadly sort of looking beyond Freshwave, there's a lot of talk of neutral host and tower codes as they get presented, which is a kind of similar thing, neutral host tower codes. I mean, have you seen a big change for you in the last few? I mean, the one I'm really aware of is Cellnex, because they came along from having something like 7,000 towers a few years ago and now seem to have about a quarter of the ones that exist in Europe, and all of a sudden haven't got any more money to spend. Surprise, surprise. But
Cellnex is an interesting case in point. They borrowed a lot of money and expanded when money was cheap.
Yeah.
Interestingly, it's not particularly a tech telco conversation. It's economically. Have you been bright? You're in a capex intensive industry, but you've borrowed too much.
Yes,
would be my challenge to them.
Yeah. They do seem to. I mean, you might. As ever, we say this to all our guests, if we get into areas that are sort of professionally delicate for you, feel free to tiptoe around it. But from one of the benefits of being a journalist is we can say what the fuck we want. and we don't have to... I suppose we've got to be slightly careful about talking about Informer, but that's about it.
Yeah, but Cellnex is interesting there, just because, as you say, they seem to suddenly be in this position where, a year ago they were still off acquiring what they could from anyone, including stuff in the UK, I think, that had to go to the competition authorities. And now it's like they've changed loads of people at the executive level. And
it's caused it seems to cause lots of aggro, because, I remember covering it, their CEO resigned at the start of the year.
Yeah, he's gone. Chairman's gone, did I see that?
Yeah, well, because they got this activist investor, some English toff, who apparently used to be Rishi Sunak's mentor back when he was a city boy.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's some billionaire, but he's a sort of activist investor, and he's got in there, bought about single-figure percentages of it. But as these activist investors often do, they sort of they punch above their weight, which is fair enough. I mean, in principle, I'm in favour of activist investors. If you've got nothing but institutional investors who never do anything, then there's no pressure on the management.
Yeah.
But anyway, he seems to be not happy about how things are going at all. I don't know whether or not he wants them to keep borrowing and keep splurging, or whether he's just not happy.
That's over.
I'm not close to it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting, back to what your point about how you characterise their growth of borrowing when money was cheap, and of course interest rates are a lot higher now. So,
but you're obviously not doing that. You're presumably coming at it from a different area.
Yeah,
as well.
look, I'll come back to due kudos to the UK operators. They've agreed a technical specification. JOTS, feel free to look at it. It's on the UK mobile website.
JOTS,
literally JOTS, JOTS, Joint Operator Technical Spec. In there as well is a little bit from a process perspective. I'm very cautious to re-emphasise the operators are involved in this process. So yes, of course, my team are fronting it. We're fronting it with the customer. Because it's the operator's radio, as in their spectrum, they're involved at the front in the radio survey. So we give them the radio survey saying, here, this building, this is what the coverage is like from the macro, etc., etc. And then when we make a radio design recommendation, they're involved in the sign-off. Because somewhat, and I say this as a radio engineer, and I did work at EE for a long while, the way in which the operators fulfill their regulations is through the radio plan. So for them, it is something they have to be possessive about. It's necessary for them to be possessive about.
Yeah.
So we respect that. We taught their language. We were absolutely opening partnership.
Presumably why someone with your background is particularly handy in the role you are now, because you can speak that lingo.
And to be fair, the team, as I came in, the Freshwave radio engineering team are excellent at this.
Yeah.
They did this work themselves for years.
So you're providing sort of passive stuff that's there, but also
depending on the
radios.
So it can be passive, so it can be just the antenna,
Yep.
or it can include the active with radio. And then yes, we do also do private networks. At that point, the private network, that's either shared access spectrum licenses or local access, where we will work with the operators if they're not using some of their spectrum in a given area.
Yeah.
We'll talk to the operator saying, well, can we have a 3-5 year permission to use license?
So when you're doing like the passive and you actually have the active equipment as well, the operators are almost like an MVNO with spectrum in a way.
I mean, it's their core and their customers. I suppose I come at it from a different angle. I think, just to explain, I don't hold the encryption keys. So whilst I may own the asset in terms of the active equipment, that may be the model. It's not always the model. Sometimes the operators provide the active equipment. I do not own the keys. If you're a Vodafone customer, Vodafone have the keys. I don't see it at all.
Okay. Yeah.
You're sort of a cog in the sort of third-party cog in the process.
What it opens is enterprise pays. So just about 2/3 of our business now, the enterprise is paying. So it's not. And
Okay,
back
can you
to
expand on that concept?
There's a lot of demand out there. So having left big operator land and landed in Freshwave, I mean, really enjoying it. It's a company that's...
But you would say that?
I would say that, but I'm also being open and honest about its scale up. We're in scale up. Yeah. It has the feel of when I started in operator world in 2G days. You can see the scale. You can see where the growth is.
So it's a quickly growing area. And does what's driving that? Is it just because my personal experience, by the way, is, and we were just commenting on this in this building, cellular coverage is really bad. And I remember going to a BT press conference a few months ago. They were talking about rural coverage. We all went to the pub afterwards. No one could get a signal inside the pub. You had to go onto Wi-Fi. Is that the sort of providing a lot of the oomph?
I mean, particularly in the urban areas. So, sorry, I know you've just talked about rural, but to come back to your point, we absolutely see growth in demand. So in the urban areas, yes, obviously London leads the way, but we customers in Birmingham, Manchester and the rest, where particularly if you imagine you're a building owner, okay, so your job is to attract tenants.
Yeah.
You have no idea or who that tenant's corporate customer is. So you need to provide coverage for all the operators. So are you going to go to every single operator and negotiate? Well, as I say, the JOT spec, to be fair to the UK operators, has enabled the neutral host ecosystem. You have to talk their language. You have to respect their controls on their radio plan. But provided you do, as we feel we are very successful at, then yes, the enterprise will pay. They are happy to pay for that.
The
premium
enterprise
service.
in this scenario being the building owner, or the building manager, depending on who it is. I think about the customer in two terms. You've got the commercial piece about who's trying to attack custom for their own building. I also think about the customer in terms of the head of IT, who's got the CFO on his neck about why you're spending so much money. And this is a bit of a no-brainer. If most businesses tend to go down a bring your own device route, you don't know which SIM card they're going to use. So it's part of the niche in which organisations like yours exist is operators. They're obviously spending quite a lot of money on building out their sort of macro networks, but in the case of 5G, I mean, it's in 4G, as you were just talking about with your rural stuff. That's still a bit on the patchy side. Talking about that shared rural network thing, I think there was an EE press release this week about how they've got a few jocks connected. I don't.
I'm not knocking the jocks. My son's doing his final year at Aberdeen.
I don't mean that in a pejorative way. It's just my slang for Scottish people. Just like Yanks isn't pejorative for Americans. It's just slang. But yeah, so obviously building these things out takes a hell of a lot of time and money, and still after over a decade of trying with 4G, it's not complete in terms of geographical coverage, and perhaps. Well, perhaps never will be, although we've got things like satellites or fixed wireless access or something that can help out.
Low-flying planes.
Balloons.
They are.
Drones. But, is part of where companies like yours fit into the mix is the acknowledgement that operators are probably only going to achieve a certain amount of coverage and or capacity by themselves, and then you step in as a sort of, well, we got the rest covered, or is that oversimplifying it?
I would answer that and say, if I'm sat in at operator and I've got, to your point, a lot of government edicts around I have to swap out the Chinese and I have to achieve a certain amount of coverage, be that 4G or 5G, then clearly my CapEx profile is going to be on the macro network.
Yeah.
No, it's not about. Of course it is. You're not going to get shot if you go and hit all your macro rollout coverage numbers, right?
So the enterprises are stumping up for the equipment in a sense in this particular model. They're saying we need to do something about shitty coverage in this building, and we're going to pay to have a good service provided, and then
it's a premium.
And then the people who work here can, whatever operator they have, they can come in and they don't have to go on the Wi-Fi network.
Correct.
So would the model be, let's use this office building, although as we've already concluded, you're probably not operating here. But let's say you were, and let's say, I think the building's owned largely by Informer, at least a chunk of it is. And that Informer was the enterprise customer, and they went, all right, Freshwave, we want to make sure that Scott stops bitching about the coverage on the podcast. So we're gonna get you to put some infrastructure in, and then where do the operators fit in? Do you then go off to the operators and go, okay, I've got this deal with Informer in their 240 Blackfriars building. Do you all want in?
So the partnership, there's 3 points, I suppose, of key contact with the operators. One, commercially, strategically. So we have commercial relationships. It's fine. I've worked with all the operators, and that's great and dandy, and I get to talk to them, go to pubs with them, all the rest of it. But cards on the table, we have a commercial relationship. There are contracts in place where I can roll out the products the operators are happy with. 2 is then in the process, yes, we will do a radio survey and talk to the operators and say, this is where we're going, this is what we're looking at, this is the kind of design, are you happy with the design? 3, we do respect the operators. If they turn around and say one of the operators says Informer's a corporate customer, no, then we'll have a conversation, but we will flag it back to Informer and say to that operator, okay, you need to go talk to Informer.
This needs sorting out somehow. Yeah.
So the revenue flows for you. You would take money. You get paid obviously by the enterprise customer, but you'll have a sort of revenue stream coming into you from the operators as well.
So
it's like a team.
In that scenario, not from the operators. So in that scenario, there's a couple of commercial models. Obviously, like all things will be flexible on the commercials, but as a rule of thumb, certain amount of capex and then monthly recurring revenue. So Informer will be paying me. I look after the cellular service in the building, and then if there's any issues, I'll deal with the operators.
It's like a managed service.
It is a managed service scenario.
Okay, yeah. And is there any inertia because companies like Informer are going, we don't need to deal with this because we've got a Wi-Fi network and we can just make people go on Wi-Fi and switch on Wi-Fi calling and stuff like that? Or because there's a lot of that going on, isn't there? It seems.
It's interesting. I talked about the customer, and the thing coming to Freshwave. Oh, excuse me, too much.
Black heart.
Too much black heart too quickly.
Obviously, a bit of fizz in it.
Yeah. The thing, and look, operators are big organisations by their nature. You are, as an engineer, and I say that as somebody who was in new product development and delivery for 20 years, a long way from the customer. And I joined Freshwave, and on day one, I've got a customer in my ear.
Right.
And I like that. I genuinely like that, right? We sell to enterprises, and the customers know us, and we do a good job. We think we do a good job. And if we don't do a good job, we do a lessons learned. We're very keen on that. But that keeps you honest.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, which is a bit of a technology question, those customers, when I think about the head of IT, right, I'm the head of IT of Informa, I'm betting is a tech-savvy individual but resource light, because the CFO doesn't like to give them any money. As a rule of thumb. My CFO is no different.
Right.
So they're tech-savvy, they understand that. They also understand the limitation on Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi with a building such as this, depending on your occupancy, voice over Wi-Fi isn't going to answer the question. If you all pick up your phones and try and use your voice over Wi-Fi at the same time, Wi-Fi can't handle it. You do need a cellular service, and you need that kind of seamless. Again, it's a managed service, right? It's as ever the promise. But we find with the majority of our customers, once we've been in and we've done the delivery and it's up and running, actually we go, it's very light touch at that point. Cellular is reliable from that perspective.
Yeah.
That point you just made there is one of the most common points I've heard in favour of when people talk about private networks, and I said, what's the point of that?
Yeah.
And again, you could say, as Ian just did, you've already got Wi-Fi. Why do you need to go to all the trouble of getting some 5G private network? But that sort of reliability and scalability and I suppose ownership of the connectivity is a big part of it. So it's not surprising that you've got a professional interest in that area as well.
But you'd make a distinction yourself between, because when people talk about private network, they're almost talking about a different thing, like a sort of closed system that can only be used. And are you sort of involved in that space too?
Yeah, we do.
Right.
So we do private networks as well. We've got slightly over a dozen. We're either in operation or in delivery of private networks, mixture of 4G and 5G.
Right.
Everything from kind of very extra rural through to the
and that's
couple
you're
of
more involved
scenarios.
there, I'm guessing. In
At that point, it's not an operator relationship. At that point, we're providing the radio planning and all the active equipment, and then we're looking at the customers and understanding with them, well, what is it you want to use it for?
Could you work with an operator though on it?
Oh, yeah, we could. No, to be fair, you're right. We're very open. I mean, as a smaller company, obviously a smaller company comes with a certain amount of agility. And yes, therefore, we do work with the operators and say, well, okay, is there a model here where it may be your customer will come and do the radio bit, or maybe it's our customer and you want to own the cyber security or something like that.
Right. But they've got the spectrum as well, haven't they, I suppose? Which is
not always for a private network.
Right. Okay.
When I'm doing neutral host, it's their spectrum.
Yep.
When I'm doing a private network, sometimes it's their spectrum. Yeah. Sometimes it's the shared access spectrum, so we'll book it out from Ofcom.
So the stuff that's been fairly recently sort of, you put this up for licensing and you can buy it for a local area and it's pretty cheap apparently, isn't it, as well? I don't know what they're spending on it. But it's not
to a national thing,
relative to a national licence and
okay.
God forbid the 3G days.
Yeah. But that's a sort of younger part of the business, the private stuff, or has that been going on?
I mean, we've been progressing. Yeah. I mean, a few before I joined up, and then it's been snowballing gently.
Yep.
We'd absolutely see the growth in private networks. We just like everybody else, right? You go talk to everybody from Ernst & Young to whoever. The growth in private networks is
that was a
clear.
big thing at Mobile Congress this year. Certainly for Telecoms.com, a big thing we were going into it looking to ask people about was, where's the money in 5G? Mm-hmm. So, as you all know only too well from your current job and certainly your previous job at EE, it's don't worry about making an opening noise. Good. It's all part of the fun.
We like that.
It all adds to the ambulance. is very capex intensive, and they're rolling it out, and they've been spending all this money rolling out 5G, and it's not that obvious how anyone's making much cash out of it. And one of the pushbacks, I think the two big ones that came up for me when I asked that question, it could be of an operator, it could be a big kit vendor like Ericsson. One was fixed wireless access, especially in the States.
Yep.
And another was private networks. So that does seem to be a sort of, at least according to them when they're trying to answer shitty questions from journalists a sort of big proof point. Would you concur that market's growing nicely?
I concur. Have you read the wireless infrastructure strategy this week from government?
Yeah, well, I had to write a story on it, and I thought I'm not going to read 105 pages. I did what Scott did and picked out something juicy.
Neutral host got mentioned twice. Thank you. Yep.
I did see some references to it. Yeah, I sort of skimmed it quite quickly. But
to answer your question, yes.
Was that this week?
Particularly with private networks.
Or last
to
week.
be fair, and it's not often we say this, that's quite an informed and good, I'm going to go with the word good, makes all the right themes and the right key points strategy from government. Not often you ever hear me say that. To be fair, very good.
And it did come over that way to me. Again, credit where I'm the first to bash the governments in general, but it did look like they had some chops to it.
Yeah. Some's a little arbitrary, who cares when you turn on standalone, but apart from
we have to have standalone everywhere by 2030.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
But one thing
they love these little arbitrary targets, don't they?
But one thing they did put in to answer your question was getting the use case stacking. You've always got the first mover problem. What's your first use case? Can it justify a private network? As a rule of thumb, sometimes not. Yeah.
What is the use case you're seeing for it then? In
the first instance, some of our private networks are FWA. Yeah, so, we've got some caravan parks, very, very rural, sure as hell doesn't justify a fibre dig. Mm-hmm. So, fixed sectors out to the fixed caravans, and it works really well. We've got a couple of other private networks where I won't say who it is or where it is. Let's just say a very wide geography. Their first use case was actually telemetry for audio. They had to have audio warnings. They can't make too much noise.
Yeah.
But having built the private network, the customers then said, "Oh, can we do CCTV?" Yeah. And since then, they've come back and asked for push to talk. So you start to get this kind of stacking. Yeah. Once you build it.
So you get one that justifies it, and then they go, "We can also do this on."
And the government strategy, I felt, was very insightful because it said, well, actually, sometimes with government, you don't get to do that. Yeah. So actually, what government were trying to do is bring them all forward at the start and say, look, actually, by building this, you enable all these, put that in the business case.
Okay.
So,
that wireless was that the one that was the week before this, where you and I both went big on them signalling over mega mergers.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, you're right. It was last week.
So we got both. It was interesting. I couldn't see anyone apart from Ian and I cover this angle, and it's relevant to mention it now because we haven't done a pod. We didn't do a pod last week. We sort of skimmed through it, and being journalists, let's not say lazy, let's say pragmatic.
Well, I thought we were very not lazy.
Well, there we are.
There's headlines that we could easily pick.
No, I mean the pragmatism of being a journalist is that you will skim something and you're looking for something juicy. Yeah. So I guess, and that's not a perfect process. But anyway, Ian and I, we didn't, Ian and I don't really chat during the week before, so we just sort of compare notes once a week on the pod. But we both took exactly the same angle on this thing because we noticed there was just one little passage in it, or a couple of little passages. I think there was one towards the end. Where is it? Have I got it here? Yeah, in the strategy this is what I wrote in the conclusion. In the strategy document, it's, quote, openness to market consolidation is once more stressed under the broader heading of strengthening the investment climate. So basically, the government kept giving these signals about how, all right, or Ofcom, or whoever.
Let's merge Vodafone
and obviously
it's inevitably coming. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Which could only mean Vodafone and Three. Funnily enough, you were there on the ground when there was a big consolidation, which could easily have been blocked when BT bought EE.
I don't think it was even as subtle as that. They actually talked specifically about the deal in one section
of the
report.
Oh, I think I missed that.
They talked specifically about it, and they had the chart from Ofcom that showed that Vodafone and Three are.
That's right. Yeah, you're right.
Not making a return.
Right. They're not making.
That was my thing. Being a journalist, you want to go, should the government really be okay? Everybody's saying it's going to happen anyway, but there was
the government going, well, we think
make a return, but it's not for us to decide. But they're not making a return, and other markets have shown that there's not a problem.
So now you're passing legislation on behalf of Vodafone shareholders. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, they were saying it's not for us to decide, it's for the CMA, but then it was like, come on, CMA, get it done, kind of thing. Yeah.
So we might have skimmed over while we were headline hunting. We might have skimmed over the stuff about neutral host. What did that, if you can remember, what did that strategy have to say about that?
It talked about it in I suppose, I'll go with two major themes. One is in terms of investment, so new players, and therefore bringing kind of new capex, new investment into the market. The other one was structural, so a kind of more strategic piece around, as you look at who provides the network, particularly bear in mind their O-RAN slant from the DSIT.
Yeah.
The opportunity is here that you have other providers providing the network, not just the operators. So that was bear in mind, this is the wireless infrastructure strategy. Those are the two pieces I saw.
So
there,
people coming and using you that aren't operators, kind of.
Correct, yeah. Well, it's back to the enterprise pay.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you go to an operator? Fine, you can go to operator A, but then if operator A have installed the network here, forever and a day your corporate account is with operator A.
Yeah.
Or you go to a neutral host provider, in which case you can still shop around.
But I mean, it's quite an interesting question about the structure of the market generally with neutral hosts, because they're all there sort of grumbling about not making returns, and we need money from internet companies, and look at what a terrible
the
state
mobile
we're in.
operators.
Yeah,
Yeah.
or just telcos generally, but it's, I suppose, yeah. And there's too many networks, and you sort of think, well, we've got this model called neutral host where you have, you know, one company doing, or two, let's say, doing passive and maybe even active as well, and then other companies go on the top of that, and they're not quite MVNOs, they're a bit more than that, as you were saying. Would that not make sense to do that kind of approach at a kind of more macro level? I'm just surprised there's not been more of it. You know, it's like you look around the world and there's not much. There's evidence of it with things like NBN on the fixed line side, I guess, but there's not a lot of evidence of it on the mobile side. And
look, I suppose I'd answer it. Structurally, the UK market is a world leader when you think about what I will call true neutral hosts. That is to say, I provide the coverage for all four mobile operators in that scenario. And that's a simple commercial scenario. I know the mobile operators, the network operators, I've got a sub-say mobile, guess who worked in mobile for too long, network operators will say they've got capex coming out their ears, it's fine, it's not an issue. But truth be told, we all know if you're in a network operator, you're going to focus on a macro network. The enterprise divisions we're finding within the network operators, they want to make sure they're keeping their customer. So they want to find a solution that means their customer's happy. And some of the network operators are being quite clear on their strategies around customer service, everything from customer service to cybersecurity to a rather more IT-centric play. So they're happy to work with us and say, fine, we'll do the network. At the end of the day, we're PE backed. What does a PE company want when it says, here's some capex, go build some assets with some long-term recurring revenue?
yeah.
Fundamentally, I've got a very selfish
a nice
job.
exit plan. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think, talking about the government stuff, so, you know, since we last met, which was probably about 5 years ago, do you reckon?
Yeah, it would have been pretty
Something
lockdown.
Yeah. There's, obviously, everything's pre and post pandemic these days. It's like BCAD cut over.
Yeah.
And, you know, even since then, my sense is that telecoms has become much more of a political thing. And you've got the stuff which I might get into later, which is, you know, principally driven by America trying to use principally Huawei, but telecoms and technology as a proxy for competing with China in some geopolitical way, which only the people at the top of that government or whatever, or the deep state really know about. But then you get slightly more benign political things. Like I remember Bojo, when he was running for leader of the Tory party, kept coming out with these big, bold plans for broadband. That he'd obviously just pulled out of his arse. He didn't know what he was talking about. But
no comment.
But it's all right. He's not in power anymore. You can say what you want. He might get back there and then you'll regret it.
That's one of the better things you did, though.
Well, yeah, okay, fine. But I'm not criticising for doing it. When I support, it just seemed sort of arbitrary. Just like this 2030.
It's totally arbitrary.
Core
and then I remember people ridiculing it at one of those Connected Britain conferences, like, oh, he wants fibre to be everywhere in 2025. It's never going to happen. But if you look at where it's gone, the rollout from when he was talking about that to now, I think there was those FTTH rankings that came out earlier in the week.
Yeah, we covered that.
The UK is the most improved country in the whole of Europe. I mean,
I think we're only behind Germany in terms of general sorting it out. So the reason I asked about that is I just wonder, I would have thought, given that you've got people, and then we got this cunning plan that they announced last week, they presumably quite like organisations like yours, because in terms of their sort of political strategy, anything that helps, and they'll always jump on the coattails. I always take the piss out of this when you get a press release from someone, and then you've got some politician going, yes, somehow implying that this bit of investment that EE or whoever has made was somehow basically all down to the government, which is bollocks. They sort of jump on their coattails. But it's obvious that there's a political interest in being seen to be involved with as much of a development and an improvement of the communications infrastructure as possible. So they presumably quite like people like you who contribute to that overall effort.
I think I agree. I'm going to answer this kind of slightly abstract. I know I'm the CTO of Freshwave, so therefore I'm going to have to be careful. But I have...
He's gestured to his comms colleague.
Yes, exactly. I have obviously been engaged with DCMS before it was DCIT, including in my previous roles, particularly with new product stuff with EE and BT. I think there is a general theme, you're quite right, about ensuring it's number one, it's UK PLC.
Yeah.
You know, to be fair to government, that's their job. It's UK PLC. What's the best for UK PLC? I think to target government, they sort of woke up about, 8 years ago and went, oh yeah, this telco thing, we've not really paid attention to that for a while.
Yeah, that's
And
my
you can
feeling. Like in the
see
last
that,
decade, it's really ramped up.
It's really ramped up about, actually, this is a global ecosystem. Have we really got the part to play we thought we had?
Yeah.
So I think...
Probably coincides with Brexit as well, where we're thinking a bit more, not in terms of delegating some of this stuff to EU and having to sort it out for ourselves.
So I think that kind of reflecting on your comment, yes, necessarily there's a certain amount of politics. Look, I started as a baby engineer in the 2G days, right? Junior engineer out of university, very proud of my Motorola M301, I vaguely recall it was. And it's 10-minute talk time or whatever it was. I'm sure the director of device technology, EE, will shout at me saying it was 21 minutes or something.
So you've been telecoms from day one?
I remember having an old Ericsson phone with an aerial that you used to have to pull up.
Exactly.
What was your degree?
Oddly, boringly electronic and electrical engineering.
There we go.
Yeah, so I'm doing exactly what I said I'd do.
It's one of those useful degrees.
Not like me with my microbiology degree.
Well, that should have led to you doing
Which
something
is
rather than a
only
telecom
useful for me
podcast.
opining on COVID every now
Be
and
a
then.
millionaire in big pharma.
Yeah, exactly. I could be at...
There is a lot of money in Big Pharma.
I could be at Pfizer right now. Well, anyway, there we go. So,
I think to reflect on your point, yes, you are seeing the politicians wake up to this global ecosystem and going, hold on, what's our part to play? And then geopolitically, as we've seen the world develop, particularly in the last 18 months and accelerate, it's a bit philosophical, but I reflect on nearly 30 years in the industry. It was 30 years since the Cold War and the Iron Wall came down. And I suppose naively we went, we're a warm planet.
yeah.
Well, actually, the history of humankind is, no, you're in zones.
Yeah.
And if you're in this zone, you're not talking to
Well,
that zone.
and since then, the globalisation's been the big thing, and certainly, as you're alluding to, I think,
Hasn't really
in the
worked,
past
has it?
5 years ago, we were in kind of reverse global.
Hasn't really worked, that globalisation.
Well, I
has
think it worked all right, actually. But I think everyone's decided that it worked a bit too well.
It worked all right until you realise that you're dealing with people who might invade Taiwan at any minute,
Yeah, exactly.
or Ukraine.
I think that's the
that was a problem.
I do think it's a naivety. I come from a military
it's
family,
naive.
personally. I've never been in the military, but my family's military. Wars happen, and you... Particularly, I'd say this mobile, I'll keep to mobile, to be fair to the fixed guys, they did have this in their mind. In mobile, we were, I think, naive in that regard. We went, it's great, Huawei, deal with the Chinese, develop
Yeah, there's a lot of naivety.
And then...
I still haven't seen the evidence, though. I mean, I know...
Whether they're actually sneaking, I'd answer it a different way.
Yeah.
Think about it from a risk perspective.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to meet, ESN, Emergency Service Network. So back in the EE
that was an EE
days,
thing.
I was a technology director for that. So I met he was then consulting with Samsung and FirstNet, so I was in Washington. I met the ex-CIO of the DoD, so the CIO with the biggest budget on the planet.
DoD being American Defense Department.
Yeah,
Right.
So now he was but he'd written the white paper that mobilised what we now know to be the high-risk vendor. Yeah?
Yeah.
His point of view being, if he had to fight a war in the Pacific Theatre, he can't fight a war with his supply chain.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because America's pretty much decided that China's going to invade Taiwan at some point in the next 5 years, and therefore
Not
they could get
necessarily
as long as
wrong.
that.
I hope
Yeah,
they're wrong.
yeah, but they might be right, and it's
I
likely
don't
they're
reckon
right.
they will.
Well,
I
okay,
actually
I hope
don't-
they're not right, but
Actually,
most people
if-
seem to think they are. So
Well,
I hope they're
I mean,
not
this is a
right, but-
complete tangent, but you say most
no,
people.
it's related.
It's in the interests of certain interests, certainly in the US, to hype that up. If you look at the history of China, almost throughout history, foreign, and I know they would argue Taiwan is obviously not foreign. In fact,
Yeah.
if you say that to a Chinese person, especially a politician, you get yourself in deep shit. But military adventures, offensive as opposed to defensive military adventures, have not been a characteristic of Chinese policy at all. So I don't think it's necessarily a given.
Yeah, but
I
they've
mean,
only been around since in the country, the format that they're in, since the end of the Second
well,
World
the
War.
CCP only has, but China's obviously been around longer than we have.
Yeah, well, this will be the thing that changes it. I hate this because something's happened before. It's always going to. That's the argument people use with
I'm not saying it. I'm not
saying.
saying it's the absolute killer argument. I'm just saying it's one factor that makes me sceptical that some of this bigging up of China as an overt offensive military threat, I take with a bit of a pinch of salt, because I just don't think there's a lot of precedent for it. Obviously, they think, and believe me, I'm no apologist for the CCP. I was another thing I wrote about recently. There was some new law about AI. I've been writing a lot about AI recently because of all the sort of Chat GPT and all the Terminator stuff, which is where I extrapolate it effortlessly. And they've come up with a new law in China about AI development there, and the stipulation is it can't say anything bad about the CCP or socialism, or anything like that. In other words, it's got to be ideologically constrained, the AI there. So that's just a great illustration of how batshit that stuff is. I still don't think that just because the way in which China's run, which is not democratic, which is an autocracy, and where the only thing that's changed about China in the last 50 years is that companies have been allowed to thrive in a sort of capitalist sense, but the condition being they better not piss off the CCP or specifically in the form of Xi Jinping right now, as we're seeing with people like Jack Ma suddenly going on a holiday for a year out of the blue. But I still don't think...
Spa retreat.
Yeah, do you know what I mean? Suddenly coming back all refreshed with no more funny ideas.
No.
But I still don't think any of that necessarily means, for example, that they're going to invade Taiwan, or that if you've got a bit of Huawei kit in your base station, no one's presented the evidence, even if we accept the CCP is entirely malevolent, that gives them this sort of security backdoor. But I mean, you're a CTO, maybe.
But it's
maybe I'm
a
just
risk
ignorant.
thing, isn't it? As Tom said.
It's
You
not,
said-
I
But
don't
how much has the risk been bigged up in the absence of concrete evidence?
draw a distinction. Backdoor, that's a fair question.
Right.
Absolute fair question. I don't think it's ever about a deliberate backdoor, or at least in my experience of working with Huawei over the years, there was plenty of backdoors. There were all... I would hand on heart say 99% of them, sorry, no, that was a screw-up. That was, never look for conspiracy when screw-up answers the question.
Yeah, I generally agree on that.
I would say, though, it's about risk in supply chain. That I get.
Yeah.
I get where they're
Fair
coming
enough.
from, where you
But
can't
that's
go
a
to
more
war with
coherent
somebody who's-
thing for me.
The other issue I have with it is, and again, it's never been outright proven, but we've got court cases going back to the days of, Cisco and routers, which is the market it was first in, intellectual property infringement, dumping.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the,
Yeah.
we can come on to Open RAN, but a lot of the consolidation that happened in the radio access network market, and you'll know this better than I will, was blamed on price-based competition from Huawei that wasn't fair. Wasn't perceived to be fair in terms of...
Commercially, have they played the same rules as us? I think
Exactly.
that's a challenge.
This is
Yeah,
and
I
this
agree
is the
it's
thing
a
is like, and this is why I think this is the sort of naive thing that we have a globalized world, and Germany's very much about this. Let's deal with Russia, let's deal with China and let's have them play by WTA rules, and they will, and they'll eventually become more democratic, and we'll bring them into the system because they'll see it's in their interest to be part of the global economy. Hasn't worked.
But you see,
So-
and that I know that's a common narrative about globalization, but I think it's a distraction. I don't think globalization was ever going to, you know how like certainly certain parts of US foreign policy, I think they often refer to at least some bits of it as neocons. They've got this sort of messianic exporting democracy thing.
Yeah.
And there's this assumption that having been embraced to the global trade bosom, that China would somehow be more like America in every sense, which I think was at the very least sort of conceited and hasn't turned out to be the case. But I would argue that the real benefit, and this is another reason why I don't think they'd invade Taiwan, by the way, a real benefit of China now being very intrinsically linked to the global economic ecosystem, you could argue possibly more exposed than any other country, given how much exporting they do and how much of their wealth compared to 50 years ago. You look at, if you ever see photos of like Shanghai 50 years ago versus now, it's ridiculous the growth they've had. But that's almost entirely dependent on them being plugged into the global economic ecosystem. And if we look at what's happened, look at the precedents being set with Russia and Ukraine, the extent to which Russia got cut off by everyone, and there was this sort of slightly weird unanimity, certainly in the US sphere of influence, that everyone was just going to cut them off, and we had that stupid stuff about Russians not being allowed to play in Wimbledon, and you couldn't play fucking Tchaikovsky or something like that.
Yeah.
But I think China's probably, Xi Jinping's probably had a look at that and gone, look, we could probably invade Taiwan successfully, and then we get TSMC in, and then we get to repatriate Taiwan. Which
wouldn't they destroy everything behind? Like, you're not getting this.
Well, it's not gonna just go easily, is it?
No, but like Taiwan would be like, we're destroying the factories.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
The
They can
talent would have
sabotage.
emigrated before.
Why would they destroy the factories? They need those factories more than anybody.
No, he's
does.
talking about the Taiwanese or their interest.
If you know, look,
sabotaging
the door
if
is
they're
gonna
about to be invaded.
the door is gonna break. I'm just gonna burn the house. You know.
Yeah, the scorched earth type of thing. Anyway, but if they did that, then probably what would happen, even though it would be enormously economically painful to everyone else, much more so than cutting off Russia, it goes without saying.
Oh, God, yeah.
But I think you would get a similar degree of isolating China economically. So they'd have to really think long and hard before exposing themselves to that. I'm not saying they wouldn't do it. They might be bloody mind, or Xi Jinping might be 30 years into his reign, he's getting on a bit like Putin, thinking, what's my legacy?
Maybe it wouldn't be that bad. I mean, everybody was expecting Russia to suffer much worse than it has, but
They've done a pretty good job of ring fencing their economy.
There's a good map in The Economist, I think, either this week or last week, of countries that condemned Russia, countries that haven't, and it's like a divided globe.
Yeah.
It's like the whole of North America, most of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and then you've got these big swathes of Asia and Africa and
the other areas
by dollars, by money. It's
money.
You
know, we can buy cheap. We can buy cheap gas instead from Russia now. And
agreed, you're right. It's about half. But to be clear, if you're India, you're buying it under cost. Putin's not making money. He's getting cash in.
Yeah,
he's not making money.
But at least it props him up a bit. And it suits India, and they're going to go, well, we're not really interested in this. We're not going to take anybody's side about that.
They're not going to pick a team.
So maybe Xi rationalises it the same way. I don't know.
No.
I mean, we're getting way off topic.
I had another quick tangent the other day. Actually, I was thinking about this. When Saudi Arabia announced the whole oil thing, we're going to move away from the dollar.
Yeah.
Do you think Saudi Arabia is now worrying about all the toys they bought from the US, and is there a backdoor in those toys? And
I see. You mean the defence, their kit?
Do you think they're worried about that?
What, like Small Soldier? You thinking about a film that you watched with your kids?
No. I'm talking about fighter jets. And
they accidentally put military chips into kids' toys.
Yeah,
right. Remember that one?
Yeah. Well, but so. I mean, you're right, Pierre.
Thinking the other way around,
It just speaks to the interdependence, and that's how we got on this tangent. And we were talking about Huawei and whether or not its kit is a security threat. And I think Tom sort of redirected it in a way that I find a lot more coherent, which is supply chain security. Mm-hmm. And if
not
all
playing
we're
by the rules, I think is the other reason.
And not playing by the rules, but I think we'll find that there's some selective enforcement of people who don't play by the rules. I mean, everyone takes the piss a bit, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Ericsson played by the rules in Iraq, is it? So,
but they got spanked. So yeah, but then we weren't worried. Back to 10 years ago when organisations like EE bought a lot of stuff from Huawei.
Yeah.
We weren't worried about being overexposed to China for supply chain then, and for some reason we are now. And I think one of the main reasons we are now is because the US, and to be fair, this really kicked off under Donald Trump. I think one of his big things in 2015-16 going in was China.
But I think, and I'm going to provide a nice tangent here onto something we want to talk about anyway.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems with ignoring all the geopolitics about it, when Huawei came along in the early 2000s or whatever it was, I think it started...
Introduced by BT.
Yeah, introduced by BT, and then went on this, in the 4G era, went on this sort of rampage across Europe where their market share just went up dramatically. And all of a sudden, and then, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of companies were merging or going out of business then. Mm-hmm. Nobody's really kicking up much of a fuss about this. The last big deal that happened was 2016 with Nokia buying Alcatel-Lucent. I went all through all the regulatory documents on that, where they went and asked telcos what they thought of it in terms of impact on competition. Most of the feedback was positive. They thought it would be a stronger company. Now they're going, hang on a minute, there's too few companies, especially if Huawei, they can't use it anymore. And therefore we have this alternative proposed called Open RAN that they hope is going to bring companies into the market. But we had a much more diverse and vibrant market before all of this was allowed to happen anyway. And before Huawei was allowed to become as powerful as it was by people just deciding they were going to buy everything from Huawei and not use anybody else.
And actually,
they sort of brought this on themselves in a way, I think, a lot of the telcos.
They have, but then one thing I will say that where I do have some sympathy for the hard position towards Huawei is I think there is some quite clear evidence that there was a lot of state support for Huawei. For example, I seem to remember anecdotally people telling me about how they would get absolutely amazing financing terms of Huawei.
And that's the whole WTO thing. But even if you disregard that, the fact that this company's come along and transformed a market where everybody's very heavily reliant on them in Europe, why wasn't anybody saying at the time? Especially when all this merger activity is taking place, and then Nokia goes and buys. That's 2016. That was before the Trump era, really. Before he started sort of making. I think when he came in, it would have been.
It's 2016 is when he's elected.
It was before he started making a fuss about Chinese vendors. It was only when he was coming in.
Yeah.
Nobody was sort of making... nobody's raising concerns about we're dependent on too few radio access networks. And maybe there should have been some concern back then before people started trying to use Open RAN as a kind of square peg to hit into a round hole.
And we'll get onto Open RAN in a sec, because I'm curious to know, both from a current professional point of view and then any broader... I know both our sites have written about Open RAN from various directions this week as well. But just to finish off on that point before we get onto Open RAN, I think politics and regulation nearly always lags technology. We're seeing this with big tech. We're seeing it with things like their attempts to control the flow of information over social media, all sorts of things. It always lags. There's even talk, for example, of them trying to retrospectively undo Facebook's acquisition of Instagram, because although they thought it was fine at the time, in retrospect they think it was shit.
Yeah, well, you can't undo these things once they're done.
But that's an illustration of the lag. That's the only reason I bring it up. That's the illustration of the lag, that only 5 years after the event, they suddenly go, oh yeah, okay, I think if we knew then what we know now, we wouldn't have let it go through.
Yeah.
So anyway, but let's arrest that tangent, although we might get back onto it because I've got some geopolitical stuff up my sleeve for later on. Open RAN. So before we get into stories that we've written about Open RAN, so obviously you're involved in infrastructure, both passive and active. So on the active infrastructure side, presumably Open RAN's something that you think about, and it's got as a CTO, you got to factor that into the mix, just to sort of telegraph. In case you haven't heard, we often bang on about it on the podcast, but just to recap, often the angle we take is a degree of skepticism towards Open RAN, not that it's viable, not that it's a good idea, but just the hype, really, just how well, it's
very much hyped in your area. It's hyped in neutral hosts as making sharing easier. Yeah.
So I mean, I'll finish. I'll stop framing it there. From your point of view, what's your take on Open RAN? Is it a big part of what you do?
I'm going to answer that and say, as a technologist, Open RAN, I think architecturally is the right direction. Software eats the world. I don't disagree with that. But to be really clear, I'm the CTO for an organisation. I've got 75 employees, the vast majority of which are radio engineers or IP engineers. I am not employing, and sure as hell, my shareholders aren't going to give me 100 engineers, software engineers, to go run ORAN. Is there an ORAN product today that I will go and install in a hospital or a trading floor and say, yeah, that's great, it's fine for 7-10 years, whatever the asset life cycle is, firmware update once a year, that'll be fine. There is none. Right. So my challenge to the ORAN industry is very much, okay, enough hype, enough time in the lab, time to put up or shut up. Yep. You need in the next few years because I do think private networks, neutral hosts will continue to grow. We're seeing 30% growth in the neutral host in our enterprise pays market and year on year. Now's the time. Now let's over the next couple of years bring products. I've not touched on it before. We also do outdoor small cells. So in the urban areas, we do outdoor small cells. So that is passive for the operators. We've got. Have you been to our City of London pilot? We've got 10 sites.
No.
So you go Blackfriars Bridge, turn right.
Yep.
10 sites up there, all the way to St Paul's.
Okay.
So welcome to come and do a tour another time.
There from here.
But that's another example of where you go, well, okay, in the outdoor scenario, you've got indoor, you've got private network, and then outdoor. Are you going to cope with the, inter-vendor handover, real-time handover?
Yeah.
So I come back to as a technologist, I get it. I get where it's going. I understand it. I do think it's eventually probably the right answer, particularly the divorce between hardware and software, which, by the way, isn't ORAN necessarily.
Yeah, we're going to get into my area of one of my areas of weakness on that one.
Is there a product today that I can go and install in a hospital? No, there's not.
Because I have heard, I think it's Orange makes a particularly big deal about this, and I think they're doing something in Romania even with Vodafone, where they're using Open RAN because they're saying it makes it easier to use the same radio equipment, but have, you can have your own sort of software layer on it essentially, and keep things separate more easily than you could on a traditional radio access network. And that sounds like it plays very much into the kind of stuff that you might want to do in the future if it was say all those technology considerations are overcome and it meets performance specifications and you can marry the stuff with one vendor with another vendor and it's not a problem, then it does sound like it could be a potentially big thing.
Yeah, it could. Look, as I say, it could be. Yeah, I think I also worry a little demographically. I'm an engineer, I'm 53, and great, I've been in the industry for 28, 29 years, I've enjoyed it. I look around, I've got some great younger engineers, but as a rule of thumb, everybody's in their 40s plus.
Yeah.
So that software skills in doing radio, I think, will bear forward.
I see.
Yeah.
Is that the same as ORAN? Is that, to your point, virtualization of the radio function with, white label tin?
Yeah,
subtly
this
different.
is the stuff that's got.
Yeah, so I get to the point where Ian's very patient with me, but I detect a slight exasperation in his voice every time I conflate ORAN and VRAN. But in my defence, there was and I understand they're different. I think I understand that Open RAN is primarily about decoupling the two key components within the radio of the sort of the baseband and the
radio itself.
The radio itself.
Yeah.
And the interface between them.
Yeah. So you kind of got it there.
Okay, all right. I'm getting there. That's
the main.
He sounds so relieved. And so I understand that, and I understand that VRAN is just more about softwareizing a hell of a lot of the stuff that makes the RAN work and enabling it to run on
the baseband bit.
The baseband bit.
Ignore the radio bit, really.
Okay,
the baseband bit is softwareizing that and having separation between hardware and software, so you can run anything on general purpose equipment. It's easy to cloudify, and that's the virtualization.
And so there were two stories this week, and I've got a feeling that I know you covered one because I commended you on it. I thought it was a really interesting piece, and maybe you covered the other. The other one I'm going to mention first because it was a bit of news. Yeah, I know you covered it actually, because we just chatted about it earlier.
Yeah.
The VMO2, Virgin Media O2 in the UK has struck an Open RAN deal.
That's an easier one to talk about anyway.
You what?
That's an easier one to talk about. The other one's bloody complicated.
Yeah. Let's get into the weeds.
It's for me anyway. It might not be for Tom, but...
I don't know which one the other one is.
Well, the other one's the HQ one.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
It's a fundraising story, but they talked a bit about their strategy.
Yeah, but their propaganda is relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so they've done a deal with Mavenir, and we've had John Baker on the pod a few times. Virgin Media O2. And
actually, HQ have done a deal with Mavenir as well, but...
Okay. Anyway, let me fucking finish saying this.
Go on, carry on. Is this always what it gets like in the second half?
Once for a few Hazy Janes in. And it said, this is Nick's reporting on Telecoms.com. The agreement announced on Monday will see Mavenir's open virtualized radio access network, so open VRAN. So this is where the two get conflated.
Yeah. Well,
and this doesn't help when I'm just trying to sort out
so
the difference
in my
between
opinion,
them.
That's not an open RAN, that's a virtualized RAN.
I see. So did you cover that story?
Yeah.
Why don't you give us the top down on it, because I didn't cover it.
So
You
Virgin
understand it
Media
now.
O2, one of the big 4 UK mobile network operators, to my knowledge, is using Ericsson and Nokia, so in a 50-50 relationship. Tom knows a lot about the actual stuff that's going
Just
on,
about,
across their network, and very different position from, say, Vodafone, where they were using some Huawei and therefore under government orders you have to get that out of your system by 2027. They obviously thought, well, we'll introduce Open RAN because we don't want to. They'd gone off Nokia a bit, and they didn't want to be wholly reliant on Ericsson. So it was like, let's get Open RAN in instead of Huawei. The VMO2 motivation for it, to me, is less obvious. It's almost like it comes, I suspect, from the Telefonica side, Telefonica being one of the 50% shareholders, whose CTO, Enrique
Parent
Blanco,
of O2.
is like a real kind of evangelist for Open RAN, and they've come out with various statements about having 800 sites across their 4 main markets that are Open RAN based, and moving in this direction.
So they made a strategic move.
Yeah, and then they haven't actually, despite the fact that he's very enthusiastic about this, and he's one of the first people behind virtualization and NFV and all of this kind of stuff, they haven't done anything as extreme as Vodafone in terms of saying we want 30% of radio sites to be Open RAN by 2030, and not even gone as far as Orange in saying that everything we buy after 2025 has to be Open RAN compatible. And then you look at this number of 800 sites across 4 big markets, you kind of think, well, that's not very much, is it?
Not such a big
how many
deal.
sites have Virgin Media O2 got in the UK? Probably about 18,000, 19,000. Yeah. So I'm thinking, why would they they're not under any government orders to take out this equipment that's probably been fairly recently refreshed, a lot of it. If you look at their last earnings report, they've got 1,600 towns and cities now where they claim to have 5G. They're aiming to have 50% coverage this year. They're not going to replace equipment they've just put in, because it would be a stupid move.
Usually it's 7 years minimum.
7 years minimum. So they've not said anything about the site, the extent of the deployment.
You're right.
But my assumption is it's very, very small. The only
Right.
person who's got any kind of hint at all on the reporting side, to mention other people, is our former boss, Ray LeMaitre.
Right. Thought he was going to crop up.
He was the only person actually that Mavenir and Virgin Media O2 gave an interview to on it.
Oh, okay.
But they didn't comment on that. But he had a background source saying that, because I read his story, that they reckoned it was about 200 sites.
Right.
Which is...
So it's a bit of a dipping of the toe in the
It's bigger than
water.
a trial, but it's still not very much. And the other interesting thing to me is Mavenir goes on about, which is the vendor that's doing this. The vendor, okay, where are the other vendors? It's Open RAN. It's supposed to be a lot, but we did a podcast with John Baker, who's kind of maybe their top Open RAN sort of commercial guy, who said if you're doing Open RAN, it's all very well to say you're compatible with the specs and everything, but you've kind of got to prove that you can match up with other people in the field and show it in evidence in the field in a commercial setting. They seem to be doing everything. Mavenir's doing the baseband and the radios, having moved into the radio
So
business.
it's an Open RAN architecture, but not
Yeah.
multi-vendor.
Now, there is a reference to third-party radios being used in the press release they sent around, but there's no companies named whatsoever. And then I did ask. That was one of my questions to Virgin Media spokesperson was, sounds like you're just getting everything from one company, and he basically came back and went, well, yeah, it's just easy to do that way.
Which is back to the point which, Tom, if you've listened to the podcast, you may have heard.
I may have done, yes.
A big objection we come up with, which is principally fueled by Ian, I should not claim the credit for it, but it makes total sense to me, is it such a great step forward? If you've decided you don't want to be reliant on Nokia or Ericsson, given that you're not allowed Chinese vendors anymore, is it such a great step forward to then be just as reliant on someone else? I mean, I guess you could argue in terms of, I presume this is putting pricing pressure on Nokia and Ericsson for operators to be able to go, well, then fuck it, we might just go with Mavenir or whatever.
It's still a new player in the market.
Yeah.
It doesn't prove the Open RAN use case of matching
but it does
radios.
But it does clash with that argument
straightforward
of closed versus
capitalism,
open.
right? You got new players in the market.
Yeah.
And you've got new technologies. That's not Open RAN.
No.
Quite.
Exactly.
That's my point. It's slightly
Now, it might be, but I think what I said in my write-up was the only way that you'd really prove it in the way that John Baker says it has to be proved is if at some point Virgin goes, we're going to take out a bit of Mavenir's radios and we're going to stick some other ones in here. Maybe they will do that, or they'll take out some of their baseband stuff and put somebody else in. Maybe they will do that. I don't know. But that's the only, on his criteria, that's the only thing that would really sort of prove it to the world that this is as easy as everybody says Open RAN is, and it actually works in a kind of commercial setting.
Well, actually, looking at the
is running out.
Yeah.
The video producer's just left us.
Yeah,
Is this
now we can really
a
go
bad
mad.
sign? Is he that bad?
Yes. There was the canned quote in. I'm assuming it was canned quote rather than a direct interview from VMO2 CTO called Jeannie York. Says this is quote, extending our collaboration with Mavenir to the RAN for the first time will help us establish a future-proof open vRAN architecture. So again, we got this conflation of open RAN and vRAN that does my head in so much. Unlocking the benefits of a multi-vendor open interface while allowing us to rapidly benefit from an end-to-end network solution. So that seems
That's snappy, isn't it?
Well, and it covers quite a lot of that. What it seems to be, if I put that in words of one syllable, I assume it's she with the name Jeannie.
Yeah, it is.
She seems to be saying we're future-proofing. We're setting up an environment where we can do more Open RAN shit in future, but right now we're just sort of putting a few pieces in place and dipping our toe in the water. I don't know if that quote or anything else you know about it.
I think I'll go back to my point. Look, architecturally and technologically, I do think it's the right sense of direction. Different vendors you decompose and deconstruct. You don't want bespoke tin, bespoke software. You want to start standardizing this and how you orchestrate it, different conversation. So yeah, if you're an operator, I'd be, as you say, dipping your toe in the water, saying, right, it's time to get out of the lab, right? It's time to get in the field, see this stuff work. That's where the industry, Open RAN industry anyway, has to go in the next 3, 4, 5 years.
And that's and maybe that's what they're doing.
Love it.
That's a good
That's a good noise.
That's the last of the fizz coming out of his black heart.
The black heart makes the other ones.
So back to your point, Ian, about how extensive a rollout this is. It might be quite small.
Yeah. I'd be surprised if it wasn't small. I mean, as I say, you've got those sort of background sources that Ray cited. And Ray's pretty good, yeah.
Yeah, he knows his shit. I won't take that away from him.
No, and I just, before I knew that, I just thought, what would be the commercial rationale for them to do a wide scale rollout? I mean, Vodafone seems to be not having an easy job of trying to do it. It sounds really hard work. They've only got about 16 sites, I think, up and running.
We talk a lot about technology, right? And for obvious reasons, right? And I'm a tech, I did engineering, electronics. You get shot if you're a CTO because your customer experience is in the pan. Yeah, and that's why, hence all these trials and what you see with Vodafone, they're the right things to do because, okay, if architecturally, if technologically that's where it's going, how the hell do I make sure my customer experience is not in any way, shape or form impacted? Yeah. That's what you number one, customer experience. Yeah. I'll even worry about the economics later, right? That comes second to customer experience.
Good point.
And I wouldn't want to imply that they're behind targets because I think they said it would take a long time and they're not necessarily behind targets, but it's taking them a long time. And they have flagged certain risks, like if we can't shut down 3G quickly enough, we might have to have 2 parallel networks there for a little while, like the Huawei one running alongside the Open RAN one. And you were at the same press conference as I was at where they brought that up. And, so it's a difficult thing they're trying to do. Kind of makes you think why they... this is a curious thing for me about Open RAN is why some of the telcos care as much. Why at CEO level it even got buy-in from. I know he's not there anymore, but Nick Reed was bringing it up in earnings calls, and it's like, why do you care about that when all the chips, all the advanced chips in the world that go into phones and even now into some base station equipment, the latest sort of Habrok stuff from Nokia apparently includes some 5 nanometer stuff, is all from Taiwan. It's all from one company in Taiwan.
Exactly.
It's like, isn't that? Maybe you should worry about that rather than...
See, I would argue from my uninformed outsider sort of commentator perspective that a lot of that is because of politics.
Yeah.
And I think people,
that's
CEOs...
a hard problem to sort out, so you just maybe forget about it.
No, and the CEOs of...
Payback on a silicon factory, 20 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just...
Probably.
So, talk about high barrier to entry. That makes telecoms look like a walk in the park. But I think politics, if you're a CEO of a multinational public company, I think you're going to be very politically attuned. And people like Nick Reed are going to want to be seen to be saying the right things about something that's got so much political weight behind it as Open RAN. I think, I'll totally take Tom's word for it because he's forgotten more about the technical side of this stuff than I'll ever know. But I also take your point, Tom, about how, a paradigm shift like this is, a decades-long thing. And so it's very gradual, very sort of dipping your toe in the water. Let's see, we go back to your customer experience. Is anything getting fucked up, which is presumably how they phrase it in the boardroom.
Couldn't possibly comment.
And if it is, let's do as much just sort of testing and low exposure trialing of this stuff out and with redundancy and in parallel, so that if something goes wrong, we can quickly switch back to what we know works and all that sort of thing. And I suppose that is leading up to, we've always said that, it's Open RAN a 6G thing. And while we will push back on the oversimplification of the telecoms industry into the Gs and the decades and all that sort of thing, is it something that we're going to associate with the next generation of technology, which is probably the case. But if we do, as we know, the Gs, something like 5G comes along, but people have been chatting about it for 5 to 10 years or perhaps longer before that.
Yeah.
6G, I think, might just be open 5G with some new stuff thrown in, like sensing. And
Is everybody else bored of Gs?
yeah, really bored
Yeah.
of them.
It's like Blaze on Eraser.
No, we'll
It
agree
is,
with that.
exactly.
I think
Soon you'll just have to touch your cheek and the whole cheek will be shaved because it'll be like that long.
Yeah, and how close do you need a shave to be? Do you need to shave one more sort of nanometer of hair off? Anyway,
5G sorry, go on.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just going to embellish.
Oh,
that
you're
point.
going to
I
go
think
on the Razor thing?
No,
Well,
5G probably the last product launch of a G. Do you think? I don't
Right.
I mean,
It's been a tough one to sell.
mean, when I talked to Howard Watson, who you'll obviously know very well, about 6G at Mobile World Congress, he went, "There's no way I'm doing that again." about his referring back to his 5G rollout.
Yeah.
So, well, what's 6G going to be then? He says it's probably going to be a bit of AI. and
Probably
sensing,
wasn't
but-
happy with the wireless infrastructure strategy. I'm fairly sure at the back end of that page 100, they're showing a 6G rollout in
I
2029.
know, I did see the 6G reference.
It's a bit
Yeah.
aggressive.
Well, and that's what really interests me as someone who I just find myself naturally drawn to the confluence of sort of politics and public policy, and then what my day job is, which is the telecoms industry. They're obviously, all politicians are just really interested in tech in general, but especially telecoms. Which is why Huawei's been the focus of all this stuff. We can argue the toss indefinitely about how much of that's justified. I still would like to see more concrete evidence, but there we go. But yeah, if the government starts pushing towards this hypothetical abstract 6G, and people are still struggling to get a decent ROI on their 5G capex, they're going to be like, oh, for fuck's sake, give it a rest, government. I just wanted to, before we move on from that thing, so we've got this Open RAN versus vRAN thing. There was another story written this week, again, not by me. Andrew covered it for us, but both you and Andrew interviewed the CEO of a startup called EdgeQ.
Yeah.
And EdgeQ, I'll shut up in a second, let you explain it. But they've just got some funding, and they're involved in this space from primarily the sort of silicon direction, from the chip direction. That's right.
Yeah.
So why don't I hand over to you there, Ian? Why do we care about
Tom might be a
EdgeQ?
better person to talk to me about it. I can give my brief take. This is really complicated.
Well, but tell us, and also tell us what the CEO said to you about
the CEO is a
chip
guy
side
called
of it.
Vinay Reviery. He's really smart. Used to be a Qualcomm executive, left in 2018 to set up his own business. Really bright guy. And they have a silicon product for baseband, for the layer one side of things in the RAN, as well as, this is the thing that kind of makes them a bit different, a kind of fully deployable layer one software stack.
Okay.
So there's, and this is the gap that he's sort of seeing at the moment, is when it comes to talk about virtual RAN or open RAN, you don't have a market for merchant silicon with a kind of fully deployable PHY as well at the same time. You've got things like FlexRAN, which is just a reference design that you kind of have to build on top of, and and then you have people like Ericsson and Nokia who do the full layer one PHY software stuff, but it's sold with it's bundled into their RAN products. So Then you go to people like Marvell who are trying to get into this space as well with accelerators, but they have the silicon, they don't really have the kind of software expertise.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of gap that he's trying to exploit. And he's obviously taken really seriously because he's got deals with some really interesting companies now, like Vodafone's doing work with him.
Yeah,
Mavenir, who we just mentioned, are now doing work with him.
Mm-hmm.
And this week they announced they'd raised 75 million, which is not,
And which is
an
only Series B.
insignificant
And
amount.
if I
Series
understand
B,
how
yeah.
funding works, the first round of funding's A, then B, then C,
Yeah.
then so it's only his second
Yeah.
round of funding, and he's getting
Second round of
75
funding.
mil.
Yeah, and it's like it's like a lot of institutional investors, and there's some strategic partners in there as well. But he didn't want to name those, but he did say they were kind of very well-known household names in the business. And I mean, the interesting thing to me is because it sort of played into my little obsession almost with all of this was him pitching it very much as a kind of alternative to Intel in the baseband when it comes to virtual RAN. And I've been writing for ages now about how virtual RAN just seems to be a sort of, Intel monopoly. He's like, well, it is, but it's 100% of 1% of the RAN market because it doesn't really count for anything. But we don't want it to be.
Yeah, but part of our job, and your job especially, as you write more analytical stuff than I do, is to detect these things early and comment on them.
Yeah, and his criticisms are, they use RISC-V, which is an architecture that's quite close to ARM, I guess, but it's reduced instruction set computing, so it makes very big claims for energy efficiency, and it's much more, it's much better really than using. I mean, I think he described x86 and sort of general purpose stuff on that side of things as, which I thought was a really good description of it. It's like a Swiss Army knife. It's like you've got any tool you want, but it's not really geared up for doing one thing very, very well.
And compared to RISC, it's quite energy inefficient.
It's quite energy inefficient, so he's got very big sort of cost claims for his.
RISC stands for reduced instruction set
computing. Yeah.
Could mean knowing my shit.
And as opposed to CISC, which is complex instruction set computing, which I think x86 is, but.
As opposed to the board game where you try and take over the world.
As opposed to the board game as well, yeah. And so he's got very, like, his pitch is obviously that his solution's a lot lower cost than using an Intel chip, but you also have extra competition coming in, which everybody wants. We don't want a situation where virtual RAN turns out to be just like the sort of data center CPU market where it's been 90% Intel for years, and it's only now changing a bit because of AMD, and they're still sort of x86 anyway. So I thought it was really sort of compelling pitch. But Tom knows more about the tech
I
stuff
can't
than I
add
do.
much more than that, which is strategically, it's the right direction. It addresses a lot. I particularly like the RISC-V play.
Yeah.
A little bit of kind of carbon neutrality and go, we do tend to use a lot of power.
Yep.
Let's address that up front, and there's not much more up front than the processor.
Back to your ESG.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And he was making some claims about how expensive the Intel chips were, even versus old school like Nokia or Ericsson scenario.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I led on, because it's sort of one of the the about VRAM.
That's what caught my eye when I was reading your piece.
Cost competitive. He was saying I had this validated by somebody because who I can't name because it was on condition of anonymity, but he's telco exec and high level in an operator on the technology side, that he was saying you get a Dell server that's sort of FlexRAN's like Intel's reference architecture, FlexRAN based, that can support, it had all the criteria, I can't remember them now, would be about the server itself, sort of $5,000. He's saying you get the same equipment that does the equivalent things really from Nokia and Ericsson would be about $2,000, and that's what they're saying they can do, is that sort of £2,000, $2,000 price point.
Is he saying then that Open RAN as it is now is more expensive?
Well, on that side of things, it is. Yeah. That's vRAN.
vRAN. Yeah. There I go again.
Yeah.
Confusing the two.
But I mean, to sort of come at it from the other side, the VRAN guys might go, well, yeah, but you offset it in other ways,
Right.
Because you can centralize stuff more easily and put everything on the same, CAS platform or whatever.
VRAM without CRAN doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, exactly.
What's CRAN?
Like centralizing
your RAM. So at the moment, you, as a rule of thumb, have all your active electronics pretty close to where your antenna are.
Yeah.
If you've got fibre and decent fibre in the area, there's no reason for that. So you can actually centralize all the active electronics in one place, a big VRAN farm, a data
That's what
center.
Rakuten's done.
That's what Rakuten do, yeah.
In Japan.
Yeah, because there's a lot of dark fibre in Japan, but we don't have that here, really, do we?
Yeah, and the significance
more
of
and more in the urban areas.
Yeah.
But yeah.
the significance of fibre is that it massively facilitates the full sort of cloud environment, because the speed with which you can transfer data from this
Yep.
central cloud location to the periphery
Yeah.
is.
But the cost savings come because you've consolidated all your sort of baseband equipment in a data centre. You can even
you haven't got that
maybe use some
duplication.
of that for other
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
as well. That's the
And I understand that's the thinking behind using general
that's the
purpose.
virtualization.
Yeah, and that was when I was first trying to get my head around virtualization in a computing setting like 10, 15 years ago, when I was trying to write it up. I'm wondering what the fuck all this abstract stuff was all about. I understood that if you've got just one, let's say, I know it's much bigger than this, but let's say we've got one server rack and it can do all these different things, and part of virtualization is segmenting little bits of it. To be focused on these things, but you can do it dynamically. You can change the segmentation. It's basically incredibly efficient use of hardware resources was one of the ways in which I understood it. And if I've understood it correctly, that part of it is extending that concept to the sort of telecom space, this efficient use of hardware resources.
Yeah.
And softwareizing obviously enables you to do that, because software itself doesn't take up.
Yeah, I think sort of sharing the resources as well.
Yeah.
Having the same things that you can use for different things. That's really kind of the cost saving benefit side of it, I think.
And part of the pitch that this Edge Q guy is when you're doing some of that stuff, use our chips, not Intel chips, and it'll be half the price.
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, it feels quite disruptive.
RISC-V is potentially disruptive. And yes, this was a pretty good application for that. Yeah.
Especially if ARM starts changing its licensing model, and this is the
So
dangerous thing
RISC-V,
to
because I
play
know that
around with.
ARM just calls itself ARM now. It doesn't even capitalise it, but it's just like calling itself Leg or something. But it used to be an acronym which I think stood for Advanced RISC Machines or something like that.
I genuinely can't remember now. It's lost.
Yeah, I think
So, but RISC was the core part of the ARM
it wasn't
acronym.
Acorn then. I got that wrong.
No, maybe there was an overlap there.
maybe.
But I think the R bit of ARM was definitely RISC, which itself is this acronym of Reduced Instruction Set Computing. And this is, again, stuff I learned like 10 or 15 years ago when I was comparing ARM, because going back to my early learning on this, when I used to write for a website called Hexus, and their main interest was computing geeks, like people who build their own PCs from scratch. So they want to know about motherboards and graphic cards and that sort of thing, and chips. And this was about 2007, 2008, and I could see, where things were going with mobile. I certainly wasn't unique in that. It was around the time the iPhone came out, obviously. But I thought, this is where it's going. And I thought, because I'm at Hexus, I'll get into the chip side of it and get to know two companies, one ARM, which is based in Cambridge, and another one called Imagination Technologies, which is based in Kings Langley, both of which are roughly equidistant from where I live in Hitchin. Right. And Imagination was more on the GPU side. They're like the NVIDIA, but for embedded.
Did they get acquired by Apple? Yeah.
Did they get acquired by Apple? I know Apple fucked them over because they
Did they buy them eventually? Or I don't know. Maybe
they certainly had an absolute massive wobble because Apple basically threatened to cut them off, and they were massively overexposed to Apple in terms of their business. And Apple plays very hardball with its suppliers, is my understanding. And well,
that's
they
what
might.
Tim Cook does, isn't it?
Well, he was a supply chain guy, wasn't he? Coming in.
It was.
But I was going from that tangent. Yeah, and just sort of. The real key thing, so like Hexus would mainly write about x86, it would write about Intel and AMD chips. And then just understanding how much more energy efficient ARM was, and let's say RISC in general was, versus this x86 thing, and therefore, because I was getting into mobile, this was at a time when Intel still thought it could make chips for mobile phones. It had this codename Moorestown, I think it was called at the time. And it was never going to happen because they're so much less energy efficient. Not only will you just eat into battery life, but you also get a warm pocket. It's just not designed for that job. It's well designed for data centers and stuff where there's lots of cooling and it's process intensive. But when energy efficiency is a priority, actually RISC and as personified by ARM was better.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that we're talking about RISC outside directly of an ARM context. I imagine you seem to sort of know a little bit about this RISC-V. I hadn't really heard much about it until this week. Could you tell us a little bit more about?
Probably not as much as you think.
Right.
So I'm kind of on the edge of my comfort zone.
Okay, well, don't worry.
But
It's even closer to the edge of mine.
yeah, exactly. So, but reduced instruction set, you're quite right.
Yeah.
But now take forward the sheer volume of energy consumed in every data center in the world, because it is x86 based.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you go down the reduced instruction set? I must admit, I haven't looked at this in years, but Amazon have done quite a bit on their own
Yeah, they have.
RISC chips.
Yep, the Graviton stuff.
Yeah.
So that's the thing is that
The Terminator
RISC
1000.
and ARM have had more success, certainly ARM-based stuff, going into Intel's traditional sort of heartlands than Intel has the other way around.
yeah.
And I sort of say, I mean, Pierre's probably got one because he's such an Apple fanboy, but the latest MacBooks use...
So are you. Don't point a finger at him.
Yeah, not as much as him, though. But he's,
Wait, you have one of the littlest MacBooks?
no, I don't. No, it doesn't have an M1 chip in
Oh
it.
yeah, mine doesn't.
Well done.
And they're like they don't sound like a helicopter trying to take off. You know, when you're sort of using a lot of
The
applications.
MacBook Air doesn't
And
have a fan.
They've not given up
Right.
anything in terms of performance.
No, not at all.
No.
You know, it's like, is there things you can't do because they've made some kind of compromise? No.
Well, and that used to be the
So-
argument in favour of x86, certainly in the server environment and possibly even the PC environment. It's like, okay, fair enough, these ARM chips are quite
think
handy
just-
for a little mobile phone, but you can't do the heavy
Well,
lifting.
no, I don't think
Yeah,
it's
but
that.
that's
It
not
just
true anymore.
It just
Yeah, exactly.
covers all bases. Like things in data centers, like databases and other stuff that you wouldn't need at a base station, or
Yeah, exactly.
you wouldn't need in certain environments. You can spin that stuff out into an accelerator for a data
Yeah,
center, and have it as a smart, on a smart NIC, and use it for specific things, and
Smart Nick sounds like another name for a
and then
smart
you can abstract that. Apparently, you can abstract that stuff away with people like Wind River and what are they called, VMware and Red Hat, and still put it on the same kind of cloud platform anyway. So you're not kind of making compromises in terms of your efficiencies and what you can run on the same software platform, which is one of the things that Intel's tried to push back on before when you put that to them. But
Yeah, so I wonder if Intel is going to reach a moment of truth as it did with mobile when I was covering it sort of.
well, they are making
15
ARM
years
chips
ago.
now. They're foundry.
Yeah, I was gonna
businesses
say,
actually
they're an
making
ARM licensee.
chips.
Well, but that's as a foundry.
As a foundry, yeah.
Those aren't x86
No.
chips, obviously.
No, they're not.
I mean,
It's
Intel's proper money is not from being a foundry. Is
Not at the
my
moment.
understanding. It.
No, it probably won't be for a long time.
Yeah. But anyway, look, we're running out of time, and we wanted to cover one or two other little newsy bits.
Is it a 5-minute job?
Well, relatively short and sweet, I think. We want to get done within about the next 15, 20 minutes, I reckon. I keep trying to, I don't know if you've listened to the podcast recently, I keep trying to bring it down to more like an hour and a half, and we always end up going
How long
for
has this
2
one
hours
been?
anyway.
Been 2 hours
We must
already?
be getting on for about an hour and 40 or something, are we?
Hour and a half, yeah.
Hour and
I'm
a
going
half.
for a beer after. So.
Are you?
You're coming from here? Good man.
Excellent.
That doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
All right, have your kids gone to university now?
Yeah. We leaped forward.
What was other newsy
The Ericsson
stuff?
Nokia
Oh yeah.
stuff you
So
want.
yeah, we should cover quarterlies. Both. It's not often that Ericsson and Nokia do their quarterlies in the same week, is it?
They're really close together. They're a few days
Yeah,
apart.
okay.
One day they did them on the same day.
Really?
Helpfully, when
But-
we were on a business trip in Copenhagen, I think.
Okay. Oh yes.
Oh,
I think I
Amsterdam.
remember that.
Yeah.
No, maybe it was when we were in Copenhagen doing the digital
I remember
transformation
doing
world.
calls with Nokia's CEO and Frederick Yedling on the same day. It was weird.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't normally bother chatting to Nokia. I don't know why, but I had my little chat with Frederick
Well, 'cause
Yedling.
I know you would. I know why you don't do it, because if you're going to get him, it has to be at 6:30 in the morning.
Fuck that.
That's the time you get offered.
I don't get paid enough to do 6:30 ones. So I'll give my sort of quick overview. As ever, Tom, you know where you are in the business space. The extent to which you want to comment on any of these companies is entirely up to you. But we'll chuck it out there and you pitch in as and when. So Ericsson came out with this stuff. Their sales were entirely flat, I think, year on year.
Organic, yeah.
Yeah, adjusted for adjustments.
Great phrase.
But their margin was down quite a lot, and the reason for that,
And their net profit almost halved.
yeah, their net profit almost halved. And the primary reason for that, my understanding, was that their mix, their North American, i.e. primarily US, sales were down about 27%, I think, whereas their India sales were up about 1,000,000%.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, they're flogging a lot more stuff to India and a lot less stuff to the US, and they make a lot less margin.
I don't think that
flogging
was
stuff
the
to
whole
India.
reason.
Okay, what were the other reasons?
Because Nokia's in the same position
Yeah.
on the mobile side. Now, Nokia has a more diverse business, but I think what a lot of the press didn't point out is that one of the reasons
By which he means me.
that, no, I don't mean you.
No, you're having a dig.
No, I'm not having a dig. But one of the reasons Ericsson's profits have suffered is because of the Vonage takeover.
Right, I'll go on. No, that's interesting. I hadn't
Well,
seen that
it's a
angle.
loss-making business,
Right.
and it's a big business.
Is it
It's-
significantly loss-making?
No, but it
Right.
was loss-making when they bought it in that quarter.
And it still is.
And
Yeah.
I don't know because they've not obviously said, but it
They
was.
don't break it out.
But
Yeah.
it's they've had integration costs. They're acquiring another 2,000 staff. I mean, a few weeks before this earnings update, by the way, they said we need to cut 8,500 staff out of the business. Their headcount, if you look at how much they've, after Boy Ekam, the current CEO, came in and went on this cost-cutting spree to get them out of a lot of things they didn't want to have anything to do with anymore, like media and cloud hardware and stuff. They went right down by about 15, 20,000 employees, and they've kind of added a lot of them back on since he joined with takeover activity.
So primarily M&A, not organic hiring.
I think mainly M&A with
Right.
things like Catherine, which is a German
Yep.
antenna business. They bought a US edge sort of devices company called Cradlepoint.
Yep.
They
They
bought
didn't they?
they bought Vonage. Vonage is a big one, 6 billion. And if you look at what it added to their SG&A,
What's that stand for?
sales
again?
goods and admin or whatever cost line.
So that's
alone,
like overhead.
it was massive.
Right.
So I think so. It is. This is the other thing about Vonage is that its sales are growing. I think they're up 14% year on year in the first quarter, but they're not kind of growing at the rate they need to be growing for them to make good on this whole sort of network APIs. Future,
So there's
future
one. That
Nirvana
might be
vision
that might
they've
be a
got.
sort of a slightly more vendor neutral one where I can chuck it at you, Tom. See what you think. This was a big thing. Were you at Mobile Congress this year?
I was.
So I don't know if you agree, but a big theme, certainly early, was talking about this network exposure, this API thing, not just because Ericsson's banging on about it for the reasons that Ian was just detailing, because that was basically the purpose why it took such a big punt on Vonage, but because the GSMA came out with the thing, didn't they,
Yep.
on day one. This network exposure, as to me, it's sold as one of the key ways in which we're going to monetize 5G. So we knew what 4G was. 4G was about doing mobile broadband properly and everything that came with that. 5G is not about that. We're fine for mobile broadband. We don't need more. I mean, obviously you could always do a bit more bandwidth, but that doesn't seem to be a primary differentiator for 5G if we're going to lapse back into the Gs again, regrettably. So, and a lot of it is this sort of B2B play or just finding other ways of allowing access to the network in order to monetize it. And Ericsson and the GSMA in its announcement at the start of Mobile Congress was talking about this network exposure. Do you have a sort of perspective on network exposure and how important it is, what the potential is, what the hurdles are, anything about that?
I'd probably reflect on our earlier conversation and bringing it a little closer to home as a neutral host. There's a lot of kind of existential conversations about operators. Look, operators are going to be here in a decade, 2 decades. They're going to be here. But it's also equally true you won't necessarily have bought your local network from the operator. It's going to have been from a neutral host or a private network company or whoever. So how do you offer a guaranteed service regardless of who provided the network? And the answer is going to be with exposure APIs. Those operators, whoever they may be, over time will start to open up the APIs and say, okay, let's be honest, I build a radio network, be it this building or any other building, and I get my monthly recurring revenue. And my challenge is to turn a profit doing that when I reach a certain scale. Am I in the push-to-talk business? No, I'm not. Not at all.
Yeah.
But if you run a push-to-talk business, I've got no problem you coming onto my network. That's fine. Perfectly happy with that. And
Push to talk.
You remember Tetra? You know,
You must
the old...
remember that.
I know, I
Those-
just- But what do you mean?
Quite a long time
What do we
now.
mean by push to talk?
So you know the communication device that all the police
Oh, right, like
fire
walkie-talkie.
ambulance use?
Yeah.
Type of thing. All right,
It's
okay,
not
yeah.
walkie-talkie, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm just putting in Scott language.
I mean, Tetra, which is what that technology is 25 years
Right.
old, 20, 25 years old.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it'll be
But
replaced
it's
by
a sort
4G,
of-
5G over the
It's
years.
a more sort of bespoke type
Other
of
fine,
communication.
whether it's
Yeah.
push to talk or video or whatever.
Right. Okay. No. It's a point of principle for me that I never try and bluff it. If I don't know what something is,
It's all right.
I just ask what it
It's a
is.
big deal for Nokia as well, by the way.
Yeah.
The
Right.
network APIs thing.
Yeah,
So,
but
so
I-
that was one of my
I think
questions.
over time
to,
it's how you build up the use cases for the
Yeah.
users of the network.
They're trying to. So one of my two questions, because it's a call. It's not just me and the Nokia CEO. It's like other journalists. Although actually, the only people who I've ever seen to ask questions are me and the Bloomberg
Right.
journalists. But was are you going to do a similar thing to Ericsson and buy a big platform company? Obviously, he told me, yeah, we're planning this massive takeover of Twilio.
Take that to the
he did
bank.
say that, but he did say that it's like a massive area of strategic focus for them as well. So
Yeah, but to what extent do you think they might be? Because I noticed when I was writing up their quarterlies, they put they made up. You know, quite often with these quarterly press releases, they'll have like 5 to 10 bullets of
Yeah.
where they want to steer people's attention towards.
Yeah.
And normally, if they've had a shit quarter, they'll highlight something relatively irrelevant and try and make a big deal of it. That's not. I'm not saying that's what Nokia did with this, but they made a big deal of their sales into enterprise. About 63% year-on-year
well,
growth.
that's only accounts for a tenth of total revenue.
Yeah, exactly. But that's still pretty rapid growth.
It's up from 5% a few years
There we go.
ago. So
And
Strategically important to them.
Yeah.
They've made a target of it.
yeah, and part of the reason it'd be strategically important, presumably, is because it's strategically important to their main competitor, which
Yeah.
is selling into enterprise.
I mean, they have the nice thing for them, for Nokia, is that they have a big growing business that isn't to do with mobile.
Yeah.
They have optical was like massive for Nokia.
yeah.
That's about
so
half their
look at
revenue.
Ericsson's results, and they've got 3 problems. They've
Yeah.
got their main business is radio access network stuff, and it's profitable, but it's not growing. Everything else is loss making, and can't remember what the other problem is. But basically, that's the reason why they're having to diversify into things like APIs.
They're
and
much
talk-
more
and-
narrowly exposed.
They've made bigger punts on other things, I think, because they're kind of exposed to a 5G slowdown potentially, or flattish sort of equipment sales.
I mean, look, across the ecosystem, there's structural challenges. We all know the share prices of the operators and how much free cash flow they've got left. It's not to say there's not the demand. It's not to say that customers aren't out there asking for this and they're willing to pay for it. I think some of the vendors, what you're seeing there is structurally, are they set up to address the potential market?
Yeah.
Because at the moment, they've been set up to address the operators for obvious reasons for
Yeah.
the last 30 years.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily what the next 30 years look like for them.
Yeah, and that's, again, it remains to be seen. Ericsson's hoping that one of the things it would get from its Vonage acquisition is to be better at facing these other verticals, as we call them.
Yeah.
I prefer to say industries.
Well, they're hoping for the first revenues this year as well from that whole big pitch they've made on sort of network APIs. They're saying the first revenues come this year. They couldn't, when they got quizzed on the earnings call, sort of nail down what those would be in terms of growth. But maybe that's fair enough. I don't know.
For them as vendors, that makes sense. I
Yeah.
suppose coming closer to home, as a neutral host provider, yes, of course, we talk the operator's language, but we have to talk our customer's language. So my team are accredited in the building regulations. And yes, when we go into hospitals, if there's a hospital kind of regulator, I can't actually think of one off the top of my head, but it's kind of interesting for me, a little bit of a personal thing. I was technology director for ESN, and we were, at the time, very proud of the fact we ran the best 4G network in the country, arguably in Europe. Germans might disagree. But we went into that ESN
So like
program
them.
very proudly,
Yeah.
and we had to learn a whole bunch of new customer language.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about technology and economics for the obvious reasons. I always come back to the customer. Can you talk the customer's language? Why
Yeah.
does the customer care?
Yeah.
Why are they going to pay? And I think across the industry, we all have to get used to that. Because, do consumers care about 5G? I think you've covered that in previous podcasts.
Yes. Couldn't give a fuck.
The growth is going to be in enterprise, in B2B. So
Yeah.
you're going to start talking your customer's language, be that rail, blue light, trading floors, hospitals. You're going to talk your customer's language.
No, makes total sense. The only other point I'll make about those two, as I felt I was in a position, I wrote up both those quarterlies, and I think I I compared the two so much that even in Nokia's, my headline was similar story to Ericsson, but more diversified.
Yeah, it's similar headline to mine then.
Yeah, and it's always gratifying when we overlap, isn't it?
Yeah.
I sometimes send them a great minds think alike instant message.
I won't tell you what my mother says in reply.
But I just thought their outlooks, because I mean, both of even though Nokia's numbers, I think you'll agree, and were a bit better than Ericsson's. Yeah,
I think
certainly their sales growth was
I thought
better.
Nokia's figures were good. I mean,
but their share price still went down.
Yeah, I know it did, and I suspect that's due to.
Everybody else giving up on share prices, or is that just me?
Well, but what I treat them as is all they really are is a statement of the expectations of the city or the investors.
Yeah, I mean they missed expectations, and I think they also went after Boyacom had gone on about choppy year.
Yeah.
They sort of said similar things because.
So that's what I was leading up to. I think a lot of the time the share price actually gets affected by the outlook segment.
Yeah.
And that's
but their
what
outlook's good.
That's what I was looking to tee up. Well, their outlook. I mean, I guess it depends on how short-termist the investors are, but their outlook was it might be a bit shit next quarter as well.
Yeah,
but hopefully it'll pick up. Hopefully it'll pick up in the second half.
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was noteworthy in terms of the overall industry. And I generally treat Nokia and Ericsson not just as the companies in their own right, but as barometers of the overall industry. They're basically saying, all right, things are still a bit rubbish, and maybe investors are a bit disappointed because it feels like things have been a bit rubbish for a while.
Things are always rubbish, Scott. What are you on about?
No, but in terms of the investment environment, in terms of the business environment, it's been a long time. We had a little boom when they first came out with the vaccines after so shares went down the toilet as soon as the pandemic started, and then October
tech shares did well,
and then they came out with some vaccines which turned out to be not quite as great as we thought at the time. But at the time that led to a massive. But then it's just sort of been a bit rubbish / sort of tapering off ever since. So people are thinking it's about time that things picked up, and maybe they get a bit disappointed where each time they go, well, maybe second half of this year or maybe first half of next year. It feels like the can's being kicked down the road for the sort of bull market.
Yeah, but the bigger economy
Yeah.
is not doing very. That's the problem, isn't it? You've got interest rates being pushed up, a lot of inflation. So a lot of it's just tied into broader economic sentiment. I think.
I mean, I suppose I come back to. It's then about efficiency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Around the bush. It's about what's the efficient deployment, what's the efficient architecture.
Yeah.
And
we're seeing in headcount, people are getting laid off left, right, and centre. Hopefully not us. But I mean, I think this week we heard about Facebook laying off another lot of people, and obviously we had the Ericsson thing recently.
Yeah.
But
there seems to be a lot of trimming.
AT&T cutting up 5,000 jobs this quarter.
I don't disagree. You see that, but then equally. I'm going to say, if you're a radio engineer, I bet you are sought after.
Right.
We're after radio engineers. I know my competitors are after radio engineers and IP engineers, etc.
Yeah.
Are you in the right space?
Yeah, there are people who are wanted.
There is still growth and demand. Well, we see it, right? Let's be honest, we're growing as a company. So I don't disagree. There's the big headline pictures with Meta.
But a lot of people they're laying off are just probably weirdo foosball playing.
Have you looked
software
at the Meta,
types?
You looked at the Meta screenshots? I mean, over a beer, not
terrible.
now. Let's over a beer. Let's talk about the investment. How many billions has he invested in VR?
I think like 5.
Yeah. No, that certainly that metaverse stuff you'll get plenty of skepticism from.
It looks like The Sims.
So before we wrap up and before we have that beer and slag off Meta, I just got a little sort of typical sort of Scott Bacino sort of telecoms political rant. And again, this is at the US, and I always throat clear and say this is nothing personal, Yanks who are listening. I love America, etc. But it is also certainly in the world in which the UK inhabits and Europe, by far the dominant force politically, militarily, economically. And I just think it's throwing its weight around in an ever more sort of clumsy and counterproductive way. It reminds me a little bit, for anyone who's seen it, and if you haven't, I highly recommend it, as a film called Team America World Police, made by the... So Tom's obviously seen it.
I think in the opening 5 minutes, the Eiffel Tower takes it.
Yeah, exactly. And it's America, fuck yeah. Yeah. And part of the satire of that, and it's written by American people, the people behind South
I
Park.
recommend watching that after 6 points.
Yeah.
Properly hilarious.
Yeah. No, there's some really funny bits. I think I might have had a joint when I went and saw it in cinema. And
In the cinema?
yeah, I know. I saw it in the cinema. It's brilliant.
With a joint in the cinema?
No, we had a joint beforehand. It wouldn't just
disappointing.
spark up in the cinema. I'm not that rock and roll, mate. And anyway, the point of this, part of the point of the satire is that America's this sort of very clumsy. It's very powerful, but not necessarily very savvy, and so they go around killing terrorists, but at the same time blowing up the Eiffel Tower and that sort of thing. And that's sometimes what I think of. So I wrote a couple of things recently. The most recent one today, which I went out, the headline was UK friendly fire over Huawei ramps up. And that was inspired primarily by the fact that you've got this bureau within the Department of Commerce called the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS. And they're the ones who are principally coming up with these regulations that are hostile to Chinese vendors, primarily Huawei. And they came up with a thing in the middle of 2020, extending some sanctions that had already existed against Huawei to supply them with chips, or at least that's how we characterised it at the time. And we've spoken about it loads of times, and because then they've got all these other people get involved. Ian's written some great stuff about the broader ecosystem that gets affected by this stuff. And not only can you not sell chips to Huawei, but you can't sell them stuff that's had American IP involved in, and it all gets very convoluted. Anyway, what no one seemed to realise at the time is that also extended to hard disk drives, apparently. And so there are three dominant global providers of HDDs. There's Seagate, there's Western Digital, and there's Toshiba. So two American, one Japanese. And
Doesn't sound like a very competitive market.
no, it doesn't, does it? What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. And so they came out with this thing in August 2020, and Western Digital and Toshiba went, yeah, all right, fuck it, we'll cut off Huawei. It's not worth the aggro. But Seagate went, no, actually, we've had a look at this and we think we're all right. Obviously it affects Intel, it affects...
So their lawyers have been sacked by now.
Well, yeah, because as you were anticipating, it didn't turn out too well for them.
I think Seagate's of the three needed money the most.
Well, actually, I don't think you're right, because they're the biggest in terms of market share.
Okay.
And their annual profit is over $1 billion. So they're all right for cash. They didn't need to do it. They could have been greedy, but they could have been naive. Or my assertion is I think they were badly guided by the BIS. So there was their CTO, I think it's CFO. I think I've written that wrong in my piece. Sorry, anyone who's read it. I've put him as CTO, but I think he's CFO. Anyway, he's called Gianluca Romano. He was questioned by someone around the time, and they said, "What are you going to do about this?" And he went, "We're still going." And he went, ciao.
Niente.
And he went, we're still going through the final assessment. From what I've seen until now, I don't see any particular restriction for us in terms of being able to continue to keep the Huawei or any other customers in China. Okay, so that's what he thought at the time. And then this week, they get done for $300 million by the BIS, which the BIS it actually put prominently in its headline. It was proud of it. It's the biggest ever fine it's laid on someone. Now, Seagate, the reason I call this friendly fire is Seagate's an American company.
It's like a KPI they have to meet,
Yeah, exactly. Well, it feels like that. I mean, this is why I characterise it as friendly fire.
The BIS has a totaliser somewhere.
I think there's probably some dodgy incentives in there. For example, this 300 mil, who gets it?
They're going to build new roads with it.
They've got to pay for the US. They've got to pay for the US Chips Act. That's what.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if we were to look at the hiring of BIS, it is going to ramp up this week. Anyway, and so they get done for 300 million, and Seagate is a US company. My point is that they're coming up with these rules. I understand that what they're trying to do is geopolitically knock China down a peg or two, and there's a different conversation about whether that's desirable or ethical or whatever or doable. But when you start finding your own companies $300 million, it just feels like friendly fire, which is why I characterised it that way. And and it comes on the back of something which we never got to speak about because I wrote it last week. But there's another piece of legislation that this is actually going through. This isn't just regulation. This is actual law. And it's called the Countering Untrusted Telecommunications Abroad Act. No, sadly, I don't think... I mean, it nearly made a great...
Everybody else to work out the acronym.
I know.
Yeah, say it again.
Qatar. I mean, obviously, if there'd been an N in there, it would be quite amusing. But yeah, so... But the key ones, leaving aside a near miss of an obscene acronym, the key ones are untrusted and abroad. So what they're saying, and I've written about it and I've linked to the actual act. They're passing a law that's trying to say that no one abroad can do stuff that can use suppliers that we think are untrusted. So in other words, it's a US law that applies to other countries, which I just thought was absolutely bizarre. And when I wrote that up in the middle of last week, that got quite a lot of reads. So I think the point I want to make, and open it for comment if anyone wants, but the point I want to make is that this aggro that the US is throwing at Huawei, I think is increasingly damaging, is causing collateral damage.
Yeah.
And I just wonder where it's going to stop, and I can't see any evidence of it not ramping more and more.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some collateral damage, because you can see that even in the stuff that goes back a bit, that's a bit older, in terms of, not allowing some of the companies that make tools for fabs, for instance, to sell to China. Like, I think, is it Applied Materials and Land Research, and there's another one, I can't remember the name of them. Sounds like KLM, but it's not KLM. KLA probably.
That'll do.
They've taken a hit because I think their growth over the last few years have been largely based on selling to China, like their biggest markets, like a third of their revenues. And then you've got those guys that do EDA software as well, Cadence and Synopsys have been sort of so there's definitely kind of collateral damage involved, I think.
Yeah.
And then and the big one for me that's already sort of been caught up in it, I think, from American pressure is probably ASML in the Netherlands, where they're the only, as far as I'm aware, they're the only company that can do extreme ultraviolet lithography tools, which you sort of need to etch like silicon wafers, I think.
Yeah.
Don't really understand it properly, but
it's for
really complicated apparently. Like,
for the more cutting edge processes, yeah.
And you need that to do like really small nanometer stuff. So they were leaned on heavily by the Americans and can't sell that stuff, certainly, to China. But I think they're even now trying to prevent them from selling the older generation stuff, which is called deep ultraviolet lithography. So it's a bit of a mess, totally, in terms of.
Yeah, and
I don't know how it's all going to shake out.
I think they need to be called out every now and then. Obviously, we're US allies. I've had some people sort of question me and go, "Well, would you rather we were allied with China?" I don't think it's a binary thing. I think it's fair enough to call out our allies when they're overstepping and being counterproductive. I think that's the only real point I want to make about it. I mean, it's a slightly sort of dicey, delicate thing. I don't know if you've got any comment on sort of regulation or on this sort of stuff. But
not this specific regulation, no. Not really. I mean, I think something you mentioned earlier. Yeah, telco has been a capitalist venture for a long, long time. But I also agree it does need regulation. That's kind of a necessity.
Yep. Oh, totally. It needs regulation, if not only for the reason I said, the high barrier to entry. I feel that regulation is being a little bit abused. Just so we can all agree that the security threat posed by any company that may be beholden to the CCP is real. I completely concede that point. Mm-hmm. And I think the CCP's got some properly dodgy shit going on. Mm-hmm. But it's a slight thin end of the wedge thing. It's like we've got a security concern and now suddenly Seagate can't flog them hard drives.
There's another psychology, which is you pick out the first one that trips over the line and you make an example of them.
Well, do you know what? That's exactly consistent with my... I'm going to attempt some French, Pierre. There's an old phrase, I think it's from Voltaire, which is pour encourager les autres. How would you pronounce that properly?
To encourage others?
Yeah, but in French.
Pour encourager les autres?
Okay, I wasn't a million miles off there, just with a shitty English accent.
He was all right.
Mm-hmm.
Not as good as Kirk Douglas, but...
And I actually linked to the English translation. Well, actually, they've got the French and the English, but it's from a Voltaire bit of writing, and he's referring to English admirals, and basically this one admiral got killed, and people were going, what do you do that for? And anyway, here's the quote. Someone goes, "Why kill this admiral?" And the answer is, because he did not kill sufficient number of men himself. He gave battle to a French admiral, and it has been proved that he was not near enough to him. But, replied Candide, who's one of the protagonists, The French admiral was as far from the English admiral, and this is the key quote. There is no doubt of it, but in this country it's found good from time to time to kill one admiral to encourage the others. So the point is, it doesn't really matter whether the admiral screwed up. We got to kill one every now and then so the others stay on their toes. And that's what, and I link to that because that's what I think this Seagate thing is. And I think I think that's what you were suggesting, and I completely agree with you, Tom, is they're making an example of them. And there's plenty of other quotes, which I won't bore everyone with, where that back that up. They're basically going, don't fuck with us, because this is what happens. We'll even do over one of our own. And it just feels like a more sort of muscle flexing, more geopolitical muscle flexing, which makes me a little bit uncomfortable.
The Soviets would do the same thing. They would fire their own soldiers if they were coming back from an attack.
Right.
Yeah.
No, there's all sorts of quite muscular ways in which you can impose your will on the world. But, I think it's right that we call out our allies. We could call out China, we call out Russia, we call out plenty of other countries, but we like to think that we're the goodies, and sometimes we don't behave like it. So anyway, that's going off on a complete tangent. Why don't I wrap it up there? So, Tom, thanks a lot. It's
Thank you.
Great to see you again.
Likewise.
Maybe next time we'll go to rugby and have a curry after.
Yeah. That's a great idea.
It does. And thank you for listening, and make sure you join us for the next one.